The old-timer spoke to the old man. The old man talked to his son Jack, and he told him, don't forget who the fuck he owes. He knows who the fuck he owes. So I want you to go down to a place called Milestone Hauling. There's a guy named Phil. He's gonna give you a rig. You drive the rig down to Baltimore, to a concrete plant. It's on Eastern Avenue. It's the only one on the street. You can't miss it. A guy's gonna meet you there. A fairy named Ferry.
Just pull it forward and then back it in.
Let's go! All right, got it.
The Prohibition era lasted from 1920 until 1933. It was introduced as a moral crusade, intended to rid America of alcohol and the social problems that came with it. Instead, it accomplished the opposite. Drinking never disappeared. The wealthy drank. Politicians drank. Businessmen drank. Ordinary Americans drank. The only real difference was that the liquor business no longer belonged to legitimate companies. It belonged to organized crime. The billions generated by illegal alcohol transformed neighborhood gangs into sophisticated criminal enterprises. Italian and Jewish syndicates that had once competed on opposite sides of the street now found themselves working together, building relationships that stretched from New York and Chicago to Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, and beyond. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, organized crime had evolved into something America had never seen before. A national syndicate with immense wealth, political influence, and an infrastructure capable of operating across the entire country. When legal liquor returned, the money did not disappear. The syndicate simply looked for a new investment. It found Cuba. Only 90 miles from Florida, Havana offered everything the mob required. It was politically unstable, eager for foreign investment, and perfectly positioned to attract wealthy American tourists. Luxury hotels, casinos, and nightclubs promised extraordinary profits, while the island's strategic location would later make it an important transit point for heroin, moving from Europe into the United States. Cuba became far more than another gambling destination. It became the financial centerpiece of organized crime's post-Prohibition empire. No one understood that opportunity better than Meyer Lansky. As the financial architect of the National Crime Syndicate, Lansky recognized that gambling could produce fortunes with far less risk than bootlegging. When Charles "Lucky" Luciano was convicted on prostitution charges in 1936 by New York Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, Lansky effectively assumed day-to-day control of the organization's expanding financial interests. Dewey's prosecution had been part of a determined campaign against organized crime launched under Governor Herbert H. Lehman, the son of Meyer Lehman, one of the founders of Lehman Brothers. Yet history would take an unexpected turn. A decade later, after becoming governor of New York himself, Dewey approved Luciano's release and deportation to Italy. The official justification centered on Luciano's alleged wartime assistance to the United States through Operation Underworld. The Secret Office of Naval Intelligence programmed that enlisted organized crime figures to help secure the New York waterfront and reportedly provide intelligence ahead of the Allied invasion of Sicily. While Luciano served nearly a decade inside Clinton Correctional Facility, known among mobsters simply as Siberia because of its remote location in upstate New York, it was Lansky who managed the organization's expanding fortune. During those years, he oversaw the investment of millions, perhaps billions, of prohibition dollars into legitimate businesses, gambling operations, and international ventures. Those decisions would permanently establish the National Crime Syndicate inside Cuba, and lay foundations that would later intersect with anti-Castro operations during the Cold War. One of the most valuable sources for understanding this period remains the 1979 book Meyer Lansky, Mogul of the Mob. Although long out of print, the book was based largely on interviews conducted with Lansky himself while he was living in Israel during the early 1970s. According to those interviews, Lansky first established a relationship with Cuban Army officer Fulgencio Batista in 1932, just before Cuba entered one of the most turbulent periods in its modern history. The following year, Batista emerged as the dominant figure behind the sergeants' revolt. Although officially serving as chief of staff, he became the island's true power broker, controlling the government from behind the scenes before serving as Cuba's constitutional president between 1940 and 1944. In 1952, he returned through another military coup, overthrowing President Carlos Prio Socarrás and ruling as dictator until Fidel Castro's revolution finally drove him from power in 1959. Regardless of the titles he held, Batista remained the most powerful man in Cuba for more than 2 decades. Lansky understood exactly what that meant. As Batista consolidated power in 1933, Lansky arrived with something the new regime desperately needed: capital. The syndicate could deliver millions of dollars in investment. Batista could deliver licenses, protection, and political guarantees. According to Mogul of the Mob, the partnership was struck almost immediately. Soon afterwards, Lansky summoned the country's leading crime bosses to Lucky Luciano's suite in the Waldorf Towers in Manhattan. The gathering represented the emerging leadership of organized crime in America. There was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's childhood friend, trusted lieutenant, and one of the syndicate's most feared killers, who would soon head west to oversee operations in California and Hollywood. There was Mo Dalitz, the Cleveland boss, whose fortune had been built smuggling Canadian whiskey across Lake Erie during Prohibition. Cuba would become only one chapter in Dalitz's remarkable gambling career. In the decades ahead, he would earn the title Mr. Las Vegas, controlling major interests on the Strip, including the Desert Inn, later purchased by Howard Hughes. According to Lansky associate Joseph Doc Stacher, it was through Dalitz that Lansky's organization first established contact with a young Detroit labor organizer named Jimmy Hoffa. At the time, Dalitz still maintained connections to Detroit's Purple Gang, while Hoffa was beginning his rise inside the Teamsters Union. Years later, Hoffa would control the Teamsters Pension Fund, one of organized crime's greatest financial assets. Also present at the Waldorf meeting was Phil Castell, another influential New York mafioso whose career would eventually take him to New Orleans, where he worked to expand the syndicate's influence throughout the South before ultimately giving way to the rising Carlos Marcello. Together, these men committed themselves to Lansky's Cuban vision. According to Mogul of the Mob, each agreed to invest $500,000, a staggering sum during the depths of the Great Depression. Their investment was more than a business venture. It tied the future of organized crime to the casinos, hotels, and tourist industry of Havana. For the next quarter century, that gamble would pay extraordinary dividends. Joseph Doc Stacher later recalled exactly how the agreement with Batista was sealed. Suitcases filled with cash were carried directly to the Cuban leader. Lansky took Batista straight back to our hotel, opened the suitcases, and pointed at the cash. Batista just stared at the money without saying a word. Then he and Meyer shook hands, and Batista left. The understanding extended far beyond a single payment. According to Stacher, the syndicate guaranteed Batista between $3 and $5 million every year in exchange for a monopoly over casino gambling at the Hotel Nacional and other approved properties across the island. Batista would also receive a percentage of the profits. The arrangement effectively legalized organized crime's dominance of Cuba's gaming industry. Casinos quickly spread across Havana. Existing nightclubs added gambling floors. New luxury hotels rose along the waterfront, catering to wealthy American tourists eager to drink, gamble, and spend freely. At the center of it all stood the Hotel Nacional. Owned and operated by Meyer Lansky and his brother Jake, it became far more than Havana's most profitable casino. It evolved into the unofficial headquarters of the National Crime Syndicate in the Caribbean, place where fortunes were made, alliances negotiated, and some of the most consequential decisions in organized crime's history were quietly reached behind closed doors. In December 1946, the Hotel Nacional hosted the most significant gathering the American underworld had seen since the end of the Second World War. Officially, the occasion was Frank Sinatra's appearance in Havana. In reality, Sinatra's visit provided perfect cover. The true purpose was the Havana Conference. Freshly released from prison and now living in exile in Sicily, Lucky Luciano secretly returned to the Western Hemisphere, smuggled into Cuba by Lansky. Waiting for him were Joe Adonis, Carlos and Joseph Marcello, Phil Castell, Seymour Weiss, Frank Costello, Joe Profaci, Willie Moretti, Mike Miranda, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, and Vito Genovese, the men who controlled organized crime across America. One by one they approached Luciano, pledged their loyalty, and presented him with envelopes filled with cash, compensation for the years he had spent behind bars. The conference reaffirmed Luciano's authority despite his exile, but it also reinforced the principles that Lansky and Luciano had developed years earlier. Avoid unnecessary publicity, avoid internal conflict, and avoid wars that damaged business. Those rules became the foundation of the National Crime Syndicate. The system was not perfect. Within 6 months, Bugsy Siegel would be murdered in Beverly Hills amid accusations that he had diverted syndicate money while building Las Vegas. Yet despite occasional violence, the broader arrangement largely held together for the next 3 decades. As Cuba prospered, so did organized crime. By the late 1940s, the island had become more than a gambling paradise. It also occupied a strategic position in the international narcotics trade. Heroin produced in laboratories around Marseille, supplied by opium moving through Turkey and Lebanon before the rise of the Golden Triangle, increasingly found its way through Cuban channels toward the United States. Whether the Havana Conference formally addressed these developments remains open to debate, but Cuba's importance to both gambling and international smuggling continued to grow. During the 1950s, Havana entered its golden age. Luxury hotels multiplied, tourism boomed, syndicate profits soared. Among those who benefited most was Santo Trafficante Jr. of Tampa. After 1955, he became the second most influential organized crime figure in Cuba behind Lansky himself. Trafficante controlled the Sans Souci Club, held major interests in the Tropicana, and was reportedly involved in financing the Havana Hilton. Those casinos would later become far more than gambling establishments. They would provide the backdrop for the anti-Castro underground, covert intelligence operations, and eventually the web of relationships that would surface repeatedly in investigations surrounding the assassination of President John Kennedy. The casinos of Havana were more than glittering palaces built for wealthy American tourists. Behind the roulette wheels and baccarat tables stood a network of trusted operators who quietly connected organized crime, politics, and eventually some of the most controversial figures in modern American history. One of those men was Louis McWillie. As manager of Santo Trafficante Jr. Tropicana Club, McWillie occupied one of the most influential positions in Havana's gambling empire. Years later, however, his name would emerge for an entirely different reason. According to his testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, McWillie had known Jack Ruby since 1951, when the two first met in a Dallas restaurant. Their friendship endured for years. Ruby later referred to McWillie as his idol, a revealing description that reflected both admiration and loyalty. That relationship offers an important glimpse into Ruby's long-standing connections with organized crime, connections that received remarkably little attention during the Warren Commission's investigation. The relationship extended well beyond gambling. During the final months of Batista's regime, and even after Fidel Castro's revolution, McWillie reportedly helped coordinate gun shipments from the southern United States into Cuba on behalf of Santo Traficante's organization. Jack Ruby was closely associated with those operations, placing him alongside experienced smugglers and organized crime figures at precisely the moment Cuba descended into political chaos. While Meyer Lansky recognized the changing tide and withdrew from Cuba shortly before Castro consolidated power, Santo Trafficante chose a different course. Rather than abandon his enormous investments, he remained on the island in the hope of reaching an accommodation with the new revolutionary government. It proved to be a costly decision. Shortly after Castro assumed power, Trafficante was arrested by revolutionary authorities and spent much of 1959 imprisoned in Cuba. One of Trafficante's fellow prisoners was Lauren Eugene Hale. Hale would later become closely associated with anti-Castro operations and the Interpen organization, but in 1959 he was simply another detainee inside Castro's prisons. According to mercenary leader Jerry Patrick Hemming, he first encountered Hale while both men were imprisoned in Cuba after Hemming was arrested for insubordination only weeks after arriving on the island. At that stage, Hale was known primarily as Trafficante's cellmate. The relationship is confirmed in Hall's FBI file, which states, Hale shared a cell in the Cuban jail with Santos Trafficante, well-known gambler and hoodlum of Tampa and Miami, Florida. Hemming later claimed he did not meet Hale again until January 1963 in Los Angeles, nearly 4 years after their Cuban imprisonment. From there, Hale drifted into Hemming's orbit in Florida, becoming a regular presence around the Interpen organization. Hemming consistently denied that Hale was ever a formal member of Interpen, although that assertion has remained the subject of considerable debate among researchers. Once both men eventually returned to Florida, that connection did not simply disappear. Yet another visitor would add an even more intriguing dimension to the story. According to contemporary CIA reporting, Santo Trafficante was frequently visited by an American gangster named Ruby during his imprisonment. Given Jack Ruby's documented friendship with Louis McWillie, Trafficante's trusted casino manager, and Ruby's broader associations with Trafficante's organization, the identity of that visitor strongly suggests Jack Ruby himself. Inside one Cuban prison cell sat Santo Trafficante Jr. and Lauren Eugene Hale. Regularly visiting Trafficante was a gangster identified as Ruby. Only 4 years later, Jack Ruby would become one of the most recognized figures in America after shooting Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Within that single jail cell lay an extraordinary convergence of organized crime, anti-Castro paramilitary circles, and individuals who would later appear repeatedly in JFK-related investigations. Meanwhile, events elsewhere continued to blur the lines between organized crime and covert operations. During the revolutionary period of 1959, Louis McWillie reportedly worked alongside Jack Ruby in organizing and participating in gun shipments destined for Castro's forces. Buried within the final volume of the Warren Commission's supporting documents is an FBI memorandum dated December 1, 1963, identifying another participant in that network, Edward Browder Jr. Browder as one of the principal pilots involved in transporting weapons for Ruby and McWillie. Browder was no ordinary smuggler. His background already placed him within covert operations across Central America. An FBI file from 1955 identified Browder as a pilot and gun runner connected to Operation PB Success, the CIA-backed overthrow of Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. The same file also linked him to an attempted coup against Costa Rican President José Figueres Ferrer the following year, an operation that ended with Browder's arrest in Mexico City after authorities discovered illegal weapons. Hopsicker later confirmed, through interviews with Browder's son, that the pilot involved in those CIA-backed operations was indeed the same Edward Browder Jr., who subsequently flew missions connected to Jack Ruby and Louis McWillie during the Cuban gun-running effort. That continuity is difficult to dismiss. Once again, Operation PB Success appears in the background. More importantly, it introduces a potential intelligence dimension to what might otherwise appear to be a straightforward organized crime smuggling network. The further one examines the Gulf Coast during the late 1950s, the more the boundaries begin to disappear. Organized crime figures, anti-Castro activists, experienced gun runners, commercial pilots and individuals linked to American intelligence repeatedly surface within the same operations, often working alongside one another. It is among the pilots, perhaps more than anywhere else, that those overlapping worlds become impossible to ignore. Edward Browder was not the only pilot in this network with an intelligence background. Daniel Hopsicker has argued that Barry Seal, the future CIA-linked pilot and narcotics trafficker, was also flying weapons into Cuba during this same period. Operating from Louisiana was David Ferry, the Civil Air Patrol commander later identified as a recruiter of Lee Harvey Oswald and a suspected intelligence asset. Ferry, too, was reportedly involved in moving arms to Cuba. Browder, Seal and Ferry represented 3 pilots with alleged or documented intelligence connections working in the same Gulf Coast environment as mob-controlled gun-running operations. Their presence suggests that cooperation between organized crime and elements associated with American intelligence may have existed before the better-known CIA Mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Yet the pilots and the lower-level operators were still only the men carrying out the work. They flew the aircraft, transported the weapons, and maintained the routes. Men such as Jack Ruby and Louis McWillie may have helped move the merchandise, but their involvement probably began and ended at the operational level. The more important connection stood above them. His name was Norman Roughhouse Rothman. Among the many men who moved between organized crime, international politics, and covert operations during the middle of the 20th century, Rothman remains one of the most overlooked. Born in New York and later based primarily in Florida, he operated inside Santo Trafficante Jr.'s gambling empire, while maintaining long-standing connections to Meyer Lansky and the older Jewish underworld that had emerged from New York during Prohibition. By the time Rothman reached Florida, he already belonged to a generation shaped by migration, persecution, and the violent transformation of the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. Between the Russian pogroms of the late 19th century and the outbreak of the First World War, millions of Jews fled the Russian Empire. They came from territories that today form parts of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Russia. Many arrived in the United States with little money and settled in overcrowded immigrant districts such as New York's Lower East Side. They found work in factories, warehouses, markets, and the garment trades. Others entered unions, political clubs, and neighborhood associations. For young men growing up in poverty, street gangs offered something the legitimate world often denied them: money, protection, status, and a sense of belonging. These gangs were initially local. They formed around neighborhoods, families, and shared languages. Jewish boys from Russian, Polish, Galician, and Ukrainian backgrounds worked with men they had known since childhood. During Prohibition, however, the old street organizations became something much larger. Bootlegging required trucks, warehouses, ships, gunmen, accountants, and political protection. It required cooperation across ethnic and territorial lines. Jewish gangsters built alliances with Italian organizations, Irish political machines, and corrupt officials. By the end of Prohibition, many of them had become central figures in a national criminal syndicate. Meyer Lansky came from Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire and now in Belarus. He became one of the principal strategists of the National Crime Syndicate and built gambling operations stretching from New York and Florida to Cuba. Louis Lepke Buchalter was also born in the Grodno region. He became one of the most powerful labor racketeers in America and later emerged as the central figure associated with Murder Incorporated. Jacob Gura Shapiro came from the Russian Empire, in territory now associated with Ukraine. He worked alongside Buchalter in the garment district and labor rackets. Waxy Gordon was born in Poland and rose through bootlegging and gambling. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was born in Brooklyn to Jewish immigrant parents from Galicia, a region divided today between Poland and Ukraine. He became an important syndicate gunman, a close associate of Lansky, and one of the most famous figures connected to the early development of Las Vegas. Mo Dalitz was born in Boston to parents from Poland. He became a major power in the Cleveland Syndicate, and later one of the underworld figures who helped turn Las Vegas into a national gambling center. Abner Longy Zwillman, born in Newark to immigrants from the Russian Empire, became one of New Jersey's most powerful crime bosses. Morris Moe Annenberg came from East Prussia, in territory that would later become part of Poland and the Soviet sphere. He built a fortune through the racing wire business and controlled information that bookmakers across America depended upon. Benjamin Dopey Benny Fine, the son of immigrants from the Russian Empire, became an early force in labor racketeering. Dutch Schultz came from a German Jewish family in the Bronx and built an empire through beer, gambling, and the numbers racket. These men were not united simply because they were Jewish. They came from different regions, different families, and different criminal traditions. What connected them was the immigrant experience and the opportunities created by prohibition. They understood poverty, displacement, and the need to build their own systems when the established system excluded them. By the 1930s and 1940s, men such as Lansky had become rich, politically connected, and deeply embedded in American business. They owned casinos, trucking companies, hotels, clubs, and legitimate enterprises. They had relationships with union officials, judges, politicians, and intelligence officers. Then came the Second World War. The liberation of the concentration camps, including Auschwitz in January 1945, exposed the full scale of the Holocaust. Jewish communities across Europe had been destroyed. Survivors were left without homes, families, or countries willing to receive them. Before the war, the Zionist movement had spent decades attempting to build a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Support existed across Europe and the United States, but large numbers of established Jewish families had been reluctant to abandon their lives and move there. Many were settled in Europe, or had built new lives in America. The idea of a Jewish state remained powerful, but the population and military resources required to defend it were far from guaranteed. The Holocaust changed everything. Survivors began moving towards Palestine in increasing numbers. Jewish organizations raised money, purchased ships, and organized illegal immigration in defiance of British restrictions. When the State of Israel was declared in May 1948, it immediately faced war with surrounding Arab states. Israel needed weapons. The United States maintained an arms embargo, and Britain had imposed restrictions of its own. That meant rifles, machine guns, ammunition, aircraft, and military equipment had to be obtained through unofficial channels. This was a world the old syndicate understood perfectly. The same men who had moved illegal alcohol across borders during Prohibition knew how to purchase weapons under false names, conceal cargo, bribe officials, and arrange transportation. They understood ports, warehouses, trucking routes, and private airfields. They had access to cash that could not easily be traced, and contacts capable of moving goods when governments refused to act. For some Jewish organized crime figures, the effort to support Israel was not treated as another racket. It was personal. Many had come from the same Eastern European territories where Jewish communities had been massacred. Some had lost relatives during the Holocaust. Others had grown up hearing stories of pogroms, forced migration, and violence. They had spent their lives outside respectable society, but now their skills could be used to support the creation and defense of a Jewish state. Meyer Lansky was repeatedly associated with fundraising and support for Israel. Other Jewish underworld figures provided money, contacts, transportation, and protection. Labor officials also played a role because unions controlled access to ports, warehouses, and trucking networks. It was within this effort that Norman Rothman's name appeared. James P. Hoffer later identified Norman "Roughhouse" Rothman as one of the men involved in smuggling weapons to Israel despite the 1947-48 embargo. Hoffer also recalled the involvement of Jewish labor and underworld figures who used their control of transportation and union networks to move equipment that could not be acquired openly. Rothman was well suited to such work. He belonged to the Lansky world. He understood gambling, smuggling, and the movement of contraband. He had access to men who controlled warehouses, trucks, docks, and private aircraft. He could operate through legitimate businesses while maintaining relationships with the underworld. This was more than an early episode in Rothman's life. It established the pattern that would define him. Weapons were obtained in one jurisdiction, moved through another, and delivered to a political movement overseas. Criminal contacts worked alongside businessmen, union officials, and men with intelligence connections. The operation depended on secrecy, transportation, and relationships rather than formal authority. A decade later, Rothman would appear inside another revolution. By the late 1950s, he had become a central figure within Santo Trafficante Jr.'s Cuban gambling interests. Trafficante controlled some of Havana's most important casinos, but Rothman helped manage the machinery behind them. His position placed him above men such as Louis McWillie and connected him directly to Meyer Lansky's wider Cuban empire. Once again, weapons would become part of his work. As Cuba moved towards revolution, Rothman was reportedly involved in procuring arms for smuggling networks operating between the United States and the island. The same skills that had been useful during the struggle to arm Israel now became valuable in the conflict surrounding Batista and Fidel Castro. The cause had changed. The method had not. Rothman operated where organized crime, political warfare, and intelligence interests overlapped. He understood how to acquire weapons, how to move them, and how to conceal the men financing the operation. He knew casino owners, pilots, smugglers, union officials, and political intermediaries. That was what made Norman Rothman important. He was not merely a casino manager or another trafficante associate. He belonged to a generation of Jewish organized crime figures whose power had been built through migration, prohibition, and national criminal alliances. He had lived through the creation of Israel and had reportedly participated in the illegal arms networks that helped supply it. Then he carried those same methods into Cuba. By the time the Cuban Revolution began, Rothman already understood that political movements were often armed by men who never appeared in official histories. Governments announced policies and imposed embargoes. Men like Rothman found the routes around them. He had learned how to move weapons before Castro entered Havana. He had learned how organized crime could serve political objectives before the CIA formally began working with the Mafia against Cuba. And that made Norman "Roughhouse" Rothman one of the clearest bridges between the old Jewish syndicate, the birth of Israel, the Trafficante gambling empire, and the covert world that emerged along the Gulf Coast in the years leading towards Dallas. By the late 1950s, Rothman was managing Trafficante's casino properties in Havana. That placed him above Louis McWillie, who worked as a pit boss at the Sans Souci Club. Rothman also owned a financial interest in the Sans Souci. Casino management, however, was only one side of his operation. Rothman was reportedly responsible for one of the most important elements of the Cuban gun-running network, obtaining the weapons. Rothman was connected to the theft of 317 firearms from an Ohio National Guard armory on October 14, 1958. The stolen weapons were intercepted by law enforcement in West Virginia on November 4th, while being transported south towards Florida. The timing is striking. A little more than a month later, in December 1958, Army Intelligence Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cannon was acquitted at a court-martial at Fort Hood, Texas, after being accused of mishandling or removing military property. By early January 1959, Cannon had assumed a new position as an ordnance officer, giving him access to substantial stocks of surplus Army weapons. Rothman served as a principal intermediary between the Mafia's Cuban casino interests and Frank Sturgis, who briefly emerged as a gambling official under Castro's new government during 1959 and 1960. Rothman and Sturgis remained close after both relocated to Miami in 1960. Rothman eventually acquired an interest in the Biltmore Hotel in Miami Beach, which would itself become associated with organized crime activity. The Rothman-Sturgis relationship reveals the broader structure taking shape. This was not a collection of isolated smugglers accidentally crossing paths. It was an overlapping coalition of casino operators, mob intermediaries, mercenaries, military intelligence figures, and men with connections to the CIA. Jerry Patrick Hemming described that world years later in an interview with Dick Russell. Russell asked Hemming whether organized crime had maintained a meaningful relationship with Jack Ruby, and, by implication, whether those associations had any relevance to the Kennedy assassination. Hemming answered by returning to Cuba in 1958. Look, going back to things concerning the overthrow of Batista in 1958, the mob was trying to get their boys into Cuba. Sturgis, Johnny Devo, Jack Cannon, Herman Marx. They wanted people on both sides here, with Batista and with Castro. Later they operated the same way, trying to do hits against Fidel through 1959 and 1960. Russell immediately recognized the significance of the claim. He asked whether the Mafia had been attempting operations against Castro before the CIA began its own assassination plots. Hemming's answer was revealing. Well, let's say they all know one another. They get along. Quite a few of the people who had worked for the agency and had gotten into a little trouble went to work for people that knew mob people or Howard Hughes people. Everybody gets to know everybody else. That was Hemming's description of the system. There were no clean boundaries. Former intelligence officers moved into private work. Mercenaries worked for businessmen, casino owners, and organized crime figures. Mafia intermediaries maintained relations with anti-Castro militants. Hemming's description captured the essential reality of post-revolutionary Cuba. Everybody gets to know everybody else. Havana had become a meeting ground. Gangsters, intelligence officers, mercenaries, casino operators, pilots, arms dealers, and political exiles moved through the same hotels, prisons, airfields, and back rooms. Some had served Batista. Others supported Castro. Many were prepared to work with either side if the money, access, or political advantage was right. The revolution did not create these relationships. It concentrated them. The arms smuggling networks that reached into Cuba before and after Castro's victory provided the structure through which these men learned to cooperate. Weapons had to be found, financed, transported, and delivered. That required pilots, military contacts, organized crime intermediaries, political protection, and intelligence connections. Once those relationships existed, they did not simply disappear when the political situation changed. They remained in place. By the early 1960s, many of the same figures had moved into the anti-Castro underground. Some joined exile organizations. Others entered private intelligence work, covert action programs, or paramilitary groups. The loyalties shifted, but the network endured. It is within that world that the framework surrounding the Kennedy assassination begins to take shape. Long before November 22, 1963, the groundwork existed. The Gulf Coast connected New Orleans, Tampa, Miami, Texas, and Cuba. Through that corridor moved guns, money, pilots, smugglers, mob associates, mercenaries, and intelligence-linked operators. By the time Kennedy's policies placed him in direct conflict with organized crime, anti-Castro militants and elements of the national security establishment, many of those groups had already spent years working within the same shadow economy. Everybody knew everybody else. That was the real legacy of post-revolutionary Havana. It was not merely the collapse of a casino empire or the beginning of the fight against Castro. It was the creation of durable relationships between men who would continue to appear throughout the story leading to Dallas. President Lyndon Johnson announced the commission on November 29, 1963, 1 week after Kennedy's murder. Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed chairman. The other members were Senators Richard Russell and John Sherman Cooper, Representatives Hale Boggs and Gerald Ford, former CIA Director Allen Dulles, and former High Commissioner for Germany John J. McCloy. On paper, it was a balanced national panel. In practice, each man represented a different pillar of American power. Earl Warren represented the judiciary and the immense prestige of the United States Supreme Court. Too much of the American public, he embodied independence, integrity, and the rule of law. Yet Warren also had a long political history before becoming Chief Justice. In the 1948 presidential election, Warren served as the Republican nominee for vice president alongside New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey. The Dewey-Warren ticket was widely expected to defeat President Harry S. Truman before one of the greatest upsets in American political history saw Truman returned to the White House. That political partnership is significant because Dewey occupied a unique place in the history of organized crime. As New York's special prosecutor during the 1930s, Dewey built his national reputation by aggressively pursuing organized crime. He successfully prosecuted Charles "Lucky" Luciano on compulsory prostitution charges, secured the conviction of Louis Lepke Buchhalter, dismantled portions of Dutch Schultz's criminal empire, and became one of the country's most recognizable anti-Mafia figures. Yet Dewey's relationship with Luciano did not end in the courtroom. After becoming governor of New York, Dewey authorized Luciano's release in 1946 on the condition that he be deported to Italy. The official justification rested on Luciano's reported wartime assistance to the United States through Operation Underworld, the secret collaboration between the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Navy, and organized crime figures to help secure the New York waterfront against sabotage during the Second World War. Contemporary intelligence officials also believed Luciano's Sicilian contacts could prove valuable during the Allied invasion of Sicily. By the early 1960s, Robert F. Kennedy had become increasingly interested in that wartime relationship. As Attorney General, Kennedy was engaged in the most determined campaign against organized crime ever undertaken by the federal government. In examining the Mafia's national development, he inevitably encountered the unusual wartime accommodation between American intelligence and organized crime. The origins of that relationship stretched back to the Roosevelt administration, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War, before many of those intelligence functions were later absorbed into the Central Intelligence Agency after 1947. Kennedy understood that the same government which had once prosecuted Luciano had later negotiated with him. The same Thomas Dewey, who had become famous for imprisoning the Mafia boss, had ultimately approved his release following that wartime collaboration. The same Thomas Dewey, who ducked and dodged Kefauver when the senator wanted him to explain exactly what Luciano did to secure his release. Whether Dewey viewed the arrangement as a necessary act of wartime pragmatism or whether he wanted political favors in return. The facts spoke for themselves. The CIA was created. Thomas Dewey nearly became President of the United States, with Mafia support losing narrowly to Harry S. Truman. During the 1950s and early 1960s, those institutional overlaps would re-emerge in covert operations directed against Fidel Castro, where the CIA would again work with Mafia figures including Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante Jr, and Johnny Roselli. Seen in that broader context, Earl Warren's presence on the Warren Commission carried an additional layer of historical symbolism. He had once shared a national ticket with the man whose career encompassed both the most celebrated prosecution of Lucky Luciano and the political decision that ultimately returned him to freedom after the war. Warren himself was never implicated in those decisions, nor is there evidence that he maintained any relationship with organized crime. Nevertheless, the Commission's chairman was connected, through decades of Republican politics, to one of the most consequential figures in the complex history linking organized crime, wartime intelligence, and the American state. Allen Dulles represented the intelligence establishment. John McCloy represented Wall Street, corporate power, and the post-war foreign policy elite. Richard Russell represented the Senate, the military establishment, and the power of the segregationist South. Hale Boggs represented Congress and Louisiana. Gerald Ford represented the Midwest and maintained a quiet channel to the FBI. John Sherman Cooper brought diplomatic experience and a reputation for moderation. Of all the commissioners, Allen Dulles represented the clearest institutional overlap with the hidden war surrounding Cuba. Dulles had spent much of his career at the center of American intelligence and international corporate power. Before entering government, he had been a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, the Wall Street law firm that represented powerful banks and corporations with extensive overseas interests. United Fruit belonged to that world. The company was not merely a banana importer. Across Central America and the Caribbean, it controlled plantations, railways, ports, communication systems, shipping routes, and company towns. Its commercial power gave it influence over governments, particularly in Guatemala and Honduras. When the CIA overthrew Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 through Operation PB Success, United Fruit was one of the principal corporate beneficiaries. Dulles was then Director of Central Intelligence. His brother, John Foster Dulles, served as Secretary of State. Both had moved through legal and political circles connected to United Fruit and the broader corporate interests threatened by Arbenz's land reforms. The documented connection is between the Dulles world, the CIA, and United Fruit. The organized crime connection is more indirect. United Fruit depended on ports, dock labor, shipping lines, and political protection. In cities such as New Orleans, those systems existed alongside Mafia influence. The company's rise under Sam Giancana had been built through Central American politics, commercial pressure, and support for regime change. Giancana understood that control of governments, ports, and transport routes was often more valuable than ownership on paper. Those methods resembled the logic of organized crime, even when the participants were legitimate businessmen. Later, CIA operations against Fidel Castro would produce direct collaboration with Mafia figures, including Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante Jr., Carlos Marcello, and Johnny Roselli. Those assassination plots are not speculation. They were eventually acknowledged through congressional investigations and declassified records. Dulles had been removed as CIA director after the Bay of Pigs, but many of the officers, exile groups, and covert structures involved in the anti-Castro campaign had developed under his leadership. Then, after Kennedy was murdered, Dulles became one of the men responsible for investigating the crime. It created an obvious conflict. The commission was being asked to investigate a murder potentially touching Cuba, anti-Castro operations, and intelligence activity, while one of its most influential members had spent years directing the agency at the center of those operations. Dulles knew what could not be safely disclosed. He knew how intelligence agencies protected sources, concealed operations, and compartmentalized information. He understood that the full history of CIA relations with organized crime could damage the government, expose illegal operations, and deepen suspicion that Kennedy's own intelligence services had lost control of the men they had recruited. He was therefore not merely another commissioner. He was the guardian of an institution with secrets to protect. Richard Russell harbored doubts of his own. Russell was one of the most powerful men in the Senate. As chairman of the Armed Services Committee, he stood at the center of the military establishment. He was a committed Southern segregationist and a master of Senate procedure, but he was not a passive figure. He did not believe the single bullet theory. Russell resisted language in the final report that appeared to require complete certainty about the sequence of shots. He insisted on wording that allowed for disagreement over whether Kennedy and Governor John Connally had been struck by the same bullet. Privately, Russell later indicated that he was never fully convinced Oswald had acted alone. There is no reliable evidence tying Russell himself to organized crime. His importance lies in the fact that one of the Commission's most experienced and politically powerful members remained unconvinced by a central element of the official case. That matters because the final report was presented to the country as a unified conclusion. Behind closed doors, it was not. John J. McCloy represented yet another kind of power. He had served as Assistant Secretary of War, President of the World Bank, High Commissioner for Germany, and Chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. His relationships extended through Wall Street, the Rockefeller Network, major corporations, defense interests, and the institutions that shaped post-war American foreign policy. McCloy was not a mafia figure. No credible evidence places him in a criminal relationship with organized crime. But he belonged to an elite world in which intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, banks, and government officials moved easily between public and private positions. That establishment had its own reasons to avoid a national crisis. A finding that Kennedy had been killed through a conspiracy involving Cuba, organized crime, intelligence assets, or foreign actors could have destabilized the country, triggered demands for war, or exposed covert operations the government was determined to keep hidden. McCloy's role was not to protect the Mafia. It was to protect the stability of the state. Gerald Ford represented a different institutional concern. As a Michigan congressman, Ford came from a state shaped by Detroit industry, labor power, and the Teamsters. Organized crime had long maintained interests in Michigan through gambling, unions, and relationships with figures connected to Jimmy Hoffa. His controversial role came through his relationship with the FBI. Records later showed that Ford privately supplied J. Edgar Hoover's bureau with information about the commission's internal discussions. In effect, one of the commissioners was reporting back to an agency whose investigative work the commission was supposed to be independently reviewing. That illustrated how dependent the commission remained on the very institutions it was expected to scrutinize. John Sherman Cooper brought far fewer controversial associations. A former senator, judge, and diplomat, he was considered a moderate Republican. Yet even men without underworld connections operated within a commission shaped by the FBI, the CIA, and the political urgency of preventing panic. The result was an investigation that treated organized crime as peripheral, when it may have been central to understanding the environment around the assassination. From the Mafia's perspective, the commission contained familiar structures. Allen Dulles represented the CIA, an agency that had worked with organized crime against Castro. Hale Boggs represented Louisiana, where Carlos Marcello operated one of the oldest and most politically connected criminal organizations in the country. Richard Russell represented the Southern military establishment and privately doubted the commission's most controversial ballistic conclusion. John McCloy represented Wall Street and the national security elite. Gerald Ford maintained a private line to Hoover's FBI. The investigation was conducted by men whose institutions had reasons to narrow the case. The CIA had covert operations to conceal. The FBI had its reputation to protect. The White House feared war with the Soviet Union or Cuba. The political establishment feared a collapse in public confidence. Organized crime benefited from every one of those pressures without necessarily having to direct them. That was how power worked. The strongest criminal organizations did not need to order every decision. They merely needed the government to protect itself. By defining the assassination as the work of one unstable man, the Warren Commission contained the crisis. It prevented an immediate confrontation with Cuba or the Soviet Union. It protected intelligence operations. It spared the FBI from explaining its failures. It avoided a full investigation of Jack Ruby's criminal associations and the Mafia's relations with anti-Castro operatives. It also kept Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and the wider Gulf Coast network beyond the center of the inquiry. For years, the official theory survived because each institution had something to lose from reopening it. Then the commissioners themselves began to speak. Richard Russell admitted he had never fully accepted the conclusion. Hale Boggs turned against Hoover and warned that federal agencies had escaped democratic control. The consensus presented to the American public began to fracture. The most revealing challenge did not come from an outsider or a conspiracy writer. It came from inside the room. A senator had stopped believing, and a congressman from Louisiana appeared to be moving in the same direction. The most influential man connected to the Warren Commission never sat on it. He directed the agency that built much of its case, J. Edgar Hoover. The Warren Commission depended heavily on the FBI. Bureau agents interviewed witnesses, gathered physical evidence, reconstructed Lee Harvey Oswald's movements, and assembled much of the investigative framework upon which the Commission based its conclusions. Hoover reached his verdict almost immediately. Oswald had killed President Kennedy. He had acted alone. The investigation needed to reach a conclusion before speculation about a wider conspiracy spiraled into political instability, or, worse still, an international crisis at the height of the Cold War. That certainty has remained one of the most controversial aspects of the investigation. For decades, Hoover had treated organized crime as a secondary concern. While Charles Luciano, Frank Costello, Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante Jr., and dozens of other mafia leaders expanded disciplined criminal organizations across the United States, Hoover devoted the overwhelming majority of FBI resources to communists, espionage, Soviet intelligence, and political subversion. Why he did so remains the subject of intense debate. Some historians argue that Hoover was constrained by the legal powers available to the Bureau during the 1930s and 1940s. Others believe he simply regarded organized crime as a local police matter rather than a national security threat. Some point to his lifelong obsession with communism. Others argue that he disliked lengthy conspiracy investigations that rarely produced dramatic public victories. Then there are the darker theories. For decades, rumors circulated that organized crime possessed deeply compromising information about Hoover's private life. Those allegations have never been conclusively proven. What is beyond dispute is that Hoover refused for years to publicly acknowledge the existence of a nationwide mafia structure, even after evidence increasingly showed that powerful crime families coordinated rackets, labor unions, gambling, narcotics, and political corruption across state lines. By 1963, that failure had consequences. The FBI possessed enormous intelligence files on communist organizations, left-wing activists, and suspected Soviet agents. Its understanding of the Mafia was far less developed. Naturally, the Bureau looked where it had always looked. It scrutinized Oswald's Marxist beliefs, his defection to the Soviet Union, his fair play for Cuba activities, and his personal history. It spent far less energy examining Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante Jr., Jack Ruby's criminal associations, or the Underworld connections stretching between New Orleans, Dallas, Miami, Tampa, and Havana. Whether by design or institutional habit, organized crime occupied the edge of the investigation rather than its center. The question naturally follows. Why? Anthony Summers devoted considerable attention to that question in his investigation of Hoover's life. From the early 1930s until Kennedy's assassination, Hoover's reluctance to confront organized crime appeared increasingly difficult to explain. Summers explored long-standing allegations that Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky possessed compromising knowledge about Hoover's private life, and used that knowledge to ensure the FBI director never became a serious threat to the national mafia. Those claims remain controversial, but the relationships themselves are difficult to dismiss. According to New York Daily News journalist Norma Abrams, Hoover privately described an encounter with Frank Costello that took place during the 1930s, while Hoover was walking along Fifth Avenue. Abrams kept the story confidential until shortly before her death in 1989. Hoover recalled that Costello quietly approached him from behind. "Good morning, Mr. Hoover." Hoover later admitted he recognized him immediately. Rather than avoiding each other, the two men walked together for several blocks toward 57th Street. Hoover joked afterward that they had been fortunate no photographer happened to witness the conversation. His response was striking. When Costello suggested he did not wish to embarrass him, Hoover reportedly replied, "You won't embarrass me. We're not looking for you or anything." It was hardly the response many would expect from the nation's leading law enforcement officer, speaking to America's most powerful mafia boss. The relationship did not end there. Florida restaurateur Eduardo Di Sano later recalled Hoover telling him that both he and Costello maintained apartments inside the Waldorf. According to Di Sano, Costello invited Hoover upstairs to meet privately in his apartment. Hoover reportedly agreed to meet, but only downstairs rather than inside Costello's room. Hoover never revealed what they discussed. By then, Costello had grown comfortable enough to refer to Hoover simply as John, a habit apparently borrowed from newspaper columnist Walter Winchell, one of Hoover's closest friends, and another man who maintained regular contact with Costello. On another occasion, Hoover himself reportedly invited Costello for coffee. Costello laughed. "I've got to be careful about my associates," he replied. "They'll accuse me of consorting with questionable characters." The remark was classic Costello. Beneath the humor sat an unmistakable familiarity. Their relationship became even more intriguing in 1939. That year, Hoover received enormous public acclaim after announcing that Louis Lepke Buchalter, the feared head of murder incounts, had surrendered directly to him. It became one of the defining publicity victories of Hoover's early career. Thomas Dewey, then New York's district attorney, had launched what mobsters called the Big Heat, placing unprecedented pressure on organized crime. Luciano, already imprisoned, decided the pressure had become intolerable. According to later accounts, Luciano instructed Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky that Lepke had to surrender in order to relieve the growing law enforcement campaign against the Mafia. The arrangement that followed proved remarkably advantageous for Hoover. Shortly before midnight on August 24th, Hoover summoned reporters and announced that he had personally accepted Lepke's surrender on a New York street. The image was irresistible. Hoover, wearing dark glasses, waiting alone inside a limousine for one of America's most notorious killers to emerge from hiding. The Bureau claimed it had arranged the surrender through confidential FBI sources, with Walter Winchell serving as intermediary. The reality, according to numerous later accounts, was considerably different. Luciano had ordered the surrender. Costello secretly met Hoover to organize the details. Lepke was allegedly assured that surrendering to Hoover would result in lenient treatment. That promise proved worthless. Buchalter was ultimately convicted and executed in the electric chair. Hoover emerged as the national hero. Dewey and New York authorities were furious, believing Hoover had bypassed them entirely. Behind the headlines, organized crime had successfully manipulated one of the biggest law enforcement stories of the decade. If those contacts suggested cordial relations, testimony emerging years later painted a more troubling picture. Journalist Curly Harris, a mutual acquaintance of both Hoover and Costello, recalled an incident from the 1950s involving FBI surveillance outside Costello's apartment. The building's doorman informed Costello that several FBI agents had been watching the premises. Rather than panic, Costello simply telephoned Hoover. According to Harris, Costello asked why agents were staking out his building, adding that if Hoover wished to speak with him, one phone call would have been sufficient. Hoover investigated. He reportedly discovered that the surveillance had been initiated without authorization. The agents were transferred almost immediately. Whether the story unfolded exactly as Harris remembered cannot be independently verified, but it reflected a belief shared by many who knew both men, that Costello possessed unusually direct access to the FBI director. Justice Department attorney William Hundley later described another revealing encounter. While staying at the Washington apartment of Edward Bennett Williams, Costello's lawyer, Hundley answered an early morning knock at the door. Standing outside was Frank Costello. The conversation drifted toward Hoover and horse racing. Costello admitted he knew Hoover personally. Initially reluctant to continue, he relaxed after Williams assured him Hundley could be trusted. Costello smiled. Hoover will never know how many races I had to fix for those lousy $10 bets. Whether the remark was literal or simply another Costello anecdote remains impossible to establish. It nevertheless illustrated the extraordinary familiarity Costello projected whenever Hoover's name entered conversation. Other Mafia figures went further. In 1990, Carmine Lombardozzi stated that Hoover maintained friendly contact with Mafia families over many years. According to Lombardozzi, organized crime made sure Hoover was looked after whenever he attended racetracks on either coast. The understanding, he claimed, was simple. Hoover would largely leave the families alone while continuing to deny their national existence. That arrangement perfectly suited men like Costello and Meyer Lansky. Corrupting politicians, judges, police officers and public officials formed one of the foundations of organized crime. Lansky became legendary for his ability to cultivate influence without violence. Joseph Bonanno later explained the philosophy in his memoirs. Violence against law enforcement officers was bad business. It invited retaliation. It was far better to ensure officials simply chose not to interfere. According to several Mafia sources, Hoover represented the greatest success of that strategy. The alleged leverage centered on Hoover's private life. For decades, rumors surrounded Hoover's relationship with his lifelong companion and deputy director, Clyde Tolson. Modern historians continue to debate aspects of Hoover's personal life, but numerous contemporaries believed the two men shared an intimate relationship. Hoover himself appeared deeply troubled by persistent rumors regarding his sexuality. According to Dr. Marshall Ruffin's widow, Montine Ruffin, Hoover sought psychiatric treatment after the Second World War. Originally examined by Dr. William Clark at Washington's prestigious Clark, King and Carter Diagnostic Clinic, Hoover was eventually referred to Dr. Ruffin, a Harvard and Cornell-trained psychiatrist who later became mental health commissioner for the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. Mrs. Ruffin recalled that the doctors believed Hoover's anxieties centered largely upon his homosexuality and his overwhelming fear that others might discover it. My understanding was that Hoover got very paranoid about anyone finding out he was a homosexual, she later said. Everybody then understood he was homosexual, not just the doctors. According to her account, Hoover eventually abandoned treatment because he feared the psychiatric records themselves might expose him. Dr. Ruffin reportedly destroyed Hoover's medical notes before his own death in 1984. If Hoover carried such fears, organized crime operated in precisely the circles where such secrets were most vulnerable. One of those places was New York's famous Stork Club. On New Year's Eve, 1936, after dining there with Walter Winchell, Hoover and Clyde Tolson were reportedly observed by guests walking hand in hand. Whether entirely accurate or not, stories like these spread quickly through New York's tightly connected political, journalistic, and underworld circles. The Stork Club itself provided fertile ground for gossip. Its owner, Sherman Billingsley, was a former bootlegger widely reported to have maintained close connections with Frank Costello. Stories circulated that hidden microphones and two-way mirrors had been installed to monitor celebrity guests. Winchell, one of Hoover's closest confidants, regularly used the club as his unofficial office while simultaneously maintaining contact with Costello. If compromising information existed, few places were better suited to collect it. Several organized crime figures later claimed Hoover's sexuality was common knowledge inside Mafia circles. Seymour Pollock, an associate of Meyer Lansky, claimed he repeatedly saw Hoover and Clyde Tolson together at racetracks throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano later recalled notorious California mobster Frank Bompensiero loudly insulting Hoover's sexuality within earshot of the FBI director at a racetrack in 1948. Rather than responding with anger or authority, Hoover reportedly approached Bompensiero privately inside the men's room. "Frank," he allegedly said, "that's not a nice way to talk about me, especially when I have people with me." To Fratiano, one fact stood out above everything else. Bonpensiero displayed absolutely no fear of the most powerful law enforcement official in America. Fratiano later said other senior mobsters, including Los Angeles boss Jack Dragner and Chicago representative Johnny Roselli, regularly spoke about possessing proof regarding Hoover's sexuality. Roselli even repeated stories claiming Hoover had once been arrested on homosexual charges in New Orleans during the late 1920s. That allegation has never been substantiated. Yet if such an arrest had occurred, New Orleans would have been one of the worst possible places for Hoover to become compromised. The city was deeply corrupt. Political influence, police protection, and organized crime overlapped in ways few outsiders fully appreciated. Carlos Marcello's organization dominated much of the local underworld, while Meyer Lansky exercised influence through gambling, business interests, and long-established criminal partnerships. Any compromising information entering that environment could have traveled quickly through Mafia channels. Whether the blackmail allegations were true remains unresolved. What is certain is that Hoover's extraordinary reluctance to confront organized crime, his unusually cordial contacts with Frank Costello, and the FBI's persistent failure to prioritize the national mafia created questions that have never completely disappeared. By the time President Kennedy was murdered, those unanswered questions had become inseparable from the Bureau's investigation itself, and from what it chose to pursue, and what it chose to leave in the shadows. The allegations did not end with rumor. According to several underworld figures, Meyer Lansky eventually obtained something far more valuable than gossip. They claimed he acquired photographs that, if genuine, would have given organized crime extraordinary leverage over the director of the FBI. None of those claims have ever been conclusively proven, and no authenticated photographs have ever surfaced publicly. Yet the stories persisted for decades, repeated by mobsters, intelligence veterans and journalists who believed there was more behind Hoover's reluctance to confront the mafia than simple bureaucratic caution. One of the earliest accounts came from Irving Ash Resnick, the Patriarcha family's representative in Nevada, and one of the original developers of Caesar's Palace. In 1971, Resnick was speaking with writer Pete Hamill in the Galleria Bar at Caesar's. During the conversation, Resnick praised Meyer Lansky as the man who had put everything together, describing him as the strategic mind behind organized crime's national structure. Then he made a remark that caught Hamill's attention. Lansky, he said, had nailed J. Edgar Hoover. When Hamill asked what he meant, Resnick and his companion claimed Lansky possessed photographs showing Hoover and Clyde Tolson in what they described as a homosexual encounter. According to Hamill's recollection, they insisted Lansky controlled the photographs and had reached an understanding with Hoover. The FBI, they suggested, would leave Lansky's organization alone. Similar claims came from Seymour Pollock, an associate of Meyer Lansky. The homosexual thing, Pollock later said, was Hoover's Achilles heel. Pollock believed Lansky discovered Hoover's vulnerability and quietly exploited it. He never bothered any of Meyer's people. Pollock went further. When Nevada legalized gambling and Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel, he claimed Hoover quietly helped smooth obstacles surrounding the project, despite knowing exactly who stood behind it. Lansky was one of the principal financial interests. When Siegel was murdered in 1947, an execution widely believed within organized crime to have been authorized by Lansky himself, Hoover supposedly knew who was responsible, yet no meaningful federal investigation followed. Whether those assertions were true remains impossible to establish. What is documented is that Meyer Lansky avoided serious federal prosecution for decades. The first major attempt to indict him did not arrive until 1970, only 2 years before Hoover's death, and it was led primarily by the Internal Revenue Service rather than the FBI. Even those tax charges eventually collapsed, allowing Lansky to remain free until his death in 1983. The allegations grew even stranger when they began intersecting with American intelligence. Former Office of Strategic Services officer John Weitz recalled attending a dinner party during the 1950s where conversation turned to Hoover. At one point, the host left the room and returned carrying a photograph. The image, Weitz later said, was poor quality and appeared to have been taken from a distance. Nevertheless, it allegedly showed two men engaged in what appeared to be a homosexual act. The host identified them as Hoover and Clyde Tolson. Weitz refused to identify the man who showed him the photograph, but implied he had intelligence connections. Another account came from Gordon Novell, an electronics expert with long-standing links to intelligence circles. Novell claimed that James Jesus Angleton, the legendary CIA counterintelligence chief, personally showed him similar photographs. According to Novell, the images had been taken with a fisheye lens sometime around 1946. Novell claimed Angleton identified the second man as Clyde Tolson and insisted the photographs were genuine rather than fabricated. If Angleton's account was accurate, the photographs may have originated during one of the bitterest bureaucratic wars in American intelligence history. Throughout the Second World War and its aftermath, Hoover fought aggressively to prevent the Office of Strategic Services from retaining responsibility for foreign intelligence after the war. He wanted those powers transferred to the FBI. OSS Director General William Wild Bill Donovan fiercely opposed him. The rivalry became intensely personal. Hoover reportedly ordered investigations into Donovan's private life, hoping to uncover compromising material that might damage his rival politically. Donovan, who reportedly viewed Hoover as a sanctimonious moralist, was said to have responded in kind, ordering his own discreet inquiries into Hoover's relationship with Clyde Tolson. If compromising photographs ever existed, one theory suggests they may have emerged from those OSS investigations. Another possibility is equally intriguing. Lansky may have acquired them independently, or perhaps intelligence officers and organized crime simply found themselves in possession of the same material through entirely different channels. No surviving evidence has resolved that mystery. The irony, however, would have been remarkable. Hoover searched unsuccessfully for material to destroy Donovan. Donovan allegedly uncovered damaging material on Hoover. That material, according to persistent underworld stories, ultimately found its way into the hands of America's most sophisticated organized crime figures, where it could be quietly used for the rest of Hoover's career. Whatever the truth, Hoover's public position became increasingly difficult to defend. Everything changed in November 1957. Near the small village of Appalachian, New York, State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell was investigating what appeared to be an insignificant complaint involving a bad check. Instead, he stumbled across one of the most important law enforcement discoveries of the 20th century. Gathered at the lavish estate of mobster Joseph Barbara were 63 of the nation's most powerful mafia leaders, representing crime families from 15 different states. It was, for all practical purposes, a national mafia convention. For years, Hoover had insisted no nationwide criminal organization existed. Appalachian demolished that argument in a single afternoon. The timing could hardly have been worse for him. New York newspapers had already spent months documenting a bloody struggle for power inside organized crime. Frank Costello had survived an assassination attempt in the lobby of his Central Park apartment building. Frank Scalise had been murdered in the Bronx. Scalise's brother Joseph vanished, believed to have been killed, dismembered and disposed of. Then came the murder that stunned the underworld. Albert Anastasia, one of organized crime's most feared figures and the man widely believed to have overseen Murder, Inc., was shot to death while sitting in the barber's chair inside Manhattan's Park Sheraton Hotel. The violence made it impossible for Washington to continue pretending organized crime remained merely a collection of isolated local gangs. Former Attorney General William Rogers later recalled that Hoover had to be dragged, almost against his will, into launching a serious national campaign against the Mafia. For a brief period, the FBI finally began assembling intelligence on organized crime with unprecedented energy. Agents developed files, identified national leadership structures, and expanded surveillance in ways the Bureau had never previously attempted. Then, almost as suddenly as the campaign began, it faded. The investigations slowed. Resources quietly shifted elsewhere. Momentum disappeared. No convincing public explanation was ever offered. Some researchers have suggested that another influential figure entered Hoover's world at precisely the wrong moment. Louis Solon Rosenstiel. By 1957, Rosenstiel was 66 years old and among the wealthiest businessmen in America. Through Schenley Industries, he had transformed whiskey stockpiled during Prohibition into one of the nation's largest liquor empires. After the Second World War, Schenley generated annual profits approaching $49 million. Rosenstiel owned an East 80th Street mansion in Manhattan, a 1,000-acre Connecticut estate, a Florida residence complete with yacht, and his own DC-9 aircraft. Publicly, he cultivated the image of a generous philanthropist, donating more than $100 million to universities, hospitals, and charitable causes. Behind that carefully managed image lay a far more complicated story. Investigations conducted years later concluded that Rosenstiel had maintained extensive relationships with leading organized crime figures stretching back to Prohibition. In 1970, the New York State Joint Legislative Committee on Crime established that Rosenstiel and numerous Mafia associates had participated in liquor smuggling operations during the Prohibition era. Witnesses also described business meetings where Frank Costello appeared specifically to signal that Rosenstiel enjoyed Mafia protection. "Costello was there," one witness explained, "to give them a message that Rosenstiel was one of their people." The connections did not end there. Rosenstiel reportedly shared business interest with Meyer Lansky in several mob-controlled ventures, including a Las Vegas casino. During the committee's investigation, he was observed entertaining Philadelphia Mafia boss Angelo Bruno. Perhaps the committee's most important witness was Rosenstiel's fourth wife, Susan. After years of bitter divorce proceedings, in which Rosenstiel allegedly spent hundreds of thousands of dollars attempting to manufacture false evidence against her, Susan Rosenstiel appeared before investigators. Committee Chairman John Hughes believed her. Chief Counsel Edward McLaughlin believed her. McLaughlin later recalled that every significant claim capable of independent verification had been checked repeatedly and consistently proved accurate. Most of Susan Rosenstiel's testimony was delivered behind closed doors and remains sealed. When interviewed years later at her home in France, her memory remained exceptionally detailed. She described entering a world where America's wealthiest businessmen, organized crime's highest-ranking bosses, and politically connected figures moved comfortably through the same social circles. Her first dinner with Rosenstiel took place at the Waldorf. Joining them was Joe Lindsay, a close associate of Meyer Lansky. Lindsay appeared again during their honeymoon cruise. So did Robert Gould, a Schenley distributor previously imprisoned for black market activities during the Second World War. It was only the beginning of the network, she claimed, surrounded her husband. Susan Rosenstiel's account placed her husband at the very center of organized crime's leadership. Through him, she said, she met Sam Giancana, the powerful boss of the Chicago outfit, and Santo Trafficante Jr., the ruler of Florida's Mafia empire. At Rosenstiel's lavish birthday celebrations, Mafia bosses, judges, politicians, and government officials mingled as though they belonged to the same exclusive club. Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, himself a close friend of Hoover, was among the regular guests. The worlds of organized crime, business, politics, and law enforcement seemed to overlap with surprising ease. Despite repeated denials from Hoover's closest FBI aides, Lou Nichols and Cartha DeLoach, Bureau records show that Hoover's relationship with Rosenstiel stretched back decades. FBI files indicate Hoover knew of Rosenstiel and extended assistance to him as early as 1933. The connections deepened over time. When Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello orchestrated Louis Lepke Buchalter's surrender in 1939, Rosenstiel reportedly served as one of the intermediaries. In 1946, Hoover and Clyde Tolson attended a barbecue hosted by leading figures in the liquor industry, including Rosenstiel himself. According to Bureau records, their friendship accelerated after a meeting at FBI headquarters in 1956. By then, Rosenstiel had surrounded himself with men who also occupied Hoover's orbit. There was George Sokolsky, the fiercely anti-communist Hearst columnist who maintained regular contact with the FBI and routinely echoed information supplied by the Bureau. Even closer was Roy Cohn, the ambitious New York attorney whose influence stretched from organized crime to politics and eventually into Washington itself. Cohn represented Rosenstiel's legal interests, although their relationship was hardly one of genuine friendship. 2 decades later, Cohn would be disbarred, partly for helping the elderly and mentally incapacitated Rosenstiel sign documents appointing Cohn as trustee and executor, while the millionaire was reportedly no longer capable of understanding what he was signing. At the same time, Rosenstiel carefully cultivated Hoover. During the 1960s, he donated more than $1 million to the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation, an organization established to preserve Hoover's legacy and support the anti-communist ideals to which the FBI director had devoted his career. According to Susan Rosenstiel, however, their relationship extended far beyond philanthropy. She claimed Hoover was an enthusiastic gambler, particularly on horse racing. He didn't have to pay, she later recalled. If he won, he won. If he lost, he didn't pay. According to her account, Rosenstiel quietly settled Hoover's gambling debts through Roy Cohn. In return, she alleged Rosenstiel called upon Hoover whenever he needed help. Whether an associate required assistance after an arrest, a judge needed persuading, or tax authorities required gentle encouragement, Susan claimed her husband believed Hoover could make problems disappear with a single telephone call. Those allegations have never been proven, but they painted a picture of a relationship that extended well beyond social acquaintance. Susan Rosenstiel met Hoover personally during the autumn of 1957. He arrived discreetly at Rosenstiel's townhouse on East 81st Street in Manhattan. It was supposed to be a bit cloak and dagger, she later recalled. Nobody was to know he was coming. Hoover arrived alone, not with Clyde Tolson. She remembered being struck by how different he appeared from his public image. Shorter than she expected, distant, confident to the point of arrogance. Everyone in the room deferred to him. Every opinion he expressed was accepted without challenge. Conversation eventually turned to Lou Nichols. Hoover's longtime assistant was considering leaving the FBI to work directly for Rosenstiel. After about 30 minutes, Susan was quietly signaled to leave the room. Soon afterwards, Nichols did exactly that, ending more than 2 decades as one of Hoover's closest aides before joining Rosenstiel's organization. Then Susan Rosenstiel made the allegations that have defined virtually every discussion of Hoover's private life ever since. They remain among the most sensational and disputed claims ever made about the FBI director. According to Susan, her marriage had already begun to unravel after she unexpectedly discovered her husband in bed with Roy Cohn. She later recalled walking into Rosenstiel's bedroom and finding the 2 men together. Rosenstiel attempted to laugh it off, joking that it was simply the only way he could be alone with his attorney. Susan was unconvinced. Roy Cohn, she claimed, spoke openly about the private lives of powerful men within their social circle, including allegations regarding Cardinal Spellman and other influential figures. During one conversation in 1958, Rosenstiel and Cohn invited her to what they described as a private gathering at New York's Plaza Hotel. They warned her that absolute secrecy was essential. Curious, she agreed to accompany them. According to her account, they entered through a side entrance before taking a private lift to an upper-floor suite. Roy Cohn answered the door. Inside, Susan claimed she found Hoover already waiting. She alleged that Hoover was dressed in women's clothing and was introduced to her by Cohn under the name Mary. According to her recollection, Hoover greeted her formally, apparently assuming she would not recognize him. Susan insisted she recognized him immediately. Her account then described a series of events involving adult participants inside the suite. She alleged that young male guests later arrived and that sexual activity took place in the room, while Hoover, Rosenstiel, and Cohn remained present. Susan maintained she refused to participate and largely observed what unfolded around her. Those allegations have never been corroborated by independent evidence, and Hoover denied throughout his lifetime any suggestion regarding his sexuality. Nevertheless, Susan Rosenstiel repeated the story consistently over many years. She claimed Rosenstiel persuaded her to attend a second gathering, roughly a year later, by promising her an expensive pair of Harry Winston earrings. According to Susan, Hoover again appeared dressed in elaborate women's clothing. She alleged that another gathering involving adult participants followed, and that Hoover at one point asked for a Bible to be read aloud before the gathering continued. After that evening, she refused to attend any further such events. She later saw Hoover only once more, during a visit to Rosenstiel's Connecticut estate in 1961, alongside Cardinal Spellman. Notably, absent from Susan's accounts was Clyde Tolson. By the late 1950s, Tolson's health had begun to deteriorate significantly. He and Hoover remained inseparable companions and trusted colleagues until Hoover's death. But some writers have suggested that whatever personal relationship had existed between them decades earlier may by then have evolved into one based more upon companionship than romance. Susan Rosenstiel was not the only person to describe Hoover appearing in women's clothing. Two professional men, both of whom requested anonymity, later recalled an incident dating back to Washington in 1948. According to their account, they regularly visited a bar known as the Maystatt, an establishment frequented by both homosexual and heterosexual patrons. There they became acquainted with an Army supply sergeant stationed at Fort Myer, who introduced them to a network of influential homosexual men, including military officers, congressional staff, and other government officials. One evening, another member of the group produced several photographs. The first image, they claimed, showed a man unmistakably resembling J. Edgar Hoover, dressed in women's clothing, complete with wig and evening gown. Initially, they assumed it must have been a fabricated photograph. As more pictures emerged, taken from different angles, and showing additional people at what appeared to be a private party, they became convinced the images were authentic. The photographs contained no explicit sexual activity, but they reinforced stories that had circulated quietly within certain Washington circles for years. Whether those photographs were genuine has never been established. If they did exist, Hoover's choice of companions made him extraordinarily vulnerable. Louis Rosenstiel maintained long-standing business relationships with Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and numerous other senior organized crime figures. According to Susan Rosenstiel, her husband often remarked that because of Lansky and those people, Hoover could always be persuaded to help when assistance was needed. Whatever influence may or may not have existed behind closed doors, Hoover finally found himself forced to publicly acknowledge reality after the 1957 Appalachian meeting. In July 1958, with criticism mounting over the FBI's handling of organized crime, Hoover instructed the Bureau's Domestic Intelligence Division to prepare its first comprehensive study of the Mafia. Although the full 2-volume report remains classified, internal memoranda summarized its central conclusions. The Mafia existed. It operated as a distinct criminal organization. Its membership consisted primarily of individuals of Sicilian and Italian ancestry engaged in coordinated organized criminal activity throughout the United States. It was a remarkable reversal for a man who had spent years denying precisely that. The following year, Hoover began publicly promising to maintain relentless pressure on hoodlums and racketeers. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Bureau had finally embraced the fight against organized crime. Then came another breakthrough. In September 1959, FBI surveillance microphones in Chicago intercepted conversations involving Sam Giancana. During those recordings, Giancana repeatedly referred to the Commission, the governing body that coordinated the affairs of America's major mafia families, and casually listed its members one by one. For FBI agents, it was a remarkable intelligence success. For Hoover, it changed almost nothing. Despite possessing direct evidence pointing toward a national criminal leadership, Hoover continued insisting publicly that no single individual or coalition dominated organized crime across the United States. The campaign he had announced with such fanfare increasingly appeared superficial. Public pressure had forced him to acknowledge the Mafia's existence. It had not forced him to wage war against it. That would change only after a new Attorney General entered the Department of Justice. Robert Francis Kennedy. Unlike Hoover, Kennedy viewed organized crime not as a nuisance, but as one of the greatest criminal threats facing the United States. For the first time, the Mafia, and in many respects Hoover himself, would face an opponent prepared to confront both head-on. The relationship between Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and J. Edgar Hoover revealed another layer of the political landscape that existed beneath public view. In September 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower suffered a heart attack that nearly claimed his life. Washington immediately began speculating whether he would be strong enough to seek another term. If Eisenhower stepped aside, would the Democrats once again nominate Adlai Stevenson? And if Stevenson headed the ticket, might Joseph Kennedy's ambitious 38-year-old son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, finally secure the vice presidential nomination? Joseph Kennedy undoubtedly hoped his family's political rise would continue. Yet at that moment, he briefly entertained an altogether different possibility. He wanted J. Edgar Hoover to become President of the United States. Writing from Hyannisport, Kennedy dictated an extraordinary personal letter to Hoover. He told the FBI director that age had made him cynical, but that only two men in public life commanded his complete respect: Herbert Hoover and John Edgar Hoover. When columnist Walter Winchell mentioned Hoover as a possible presidential candidate, Kennedy wrote that nothing would make him happier. Whether Hoover ran as a Republican or a Democrat, Kennedy promised him the largest political contribution he had ever received and pledged to work harder for him than any member of either party. "The United States deserves you," Kennedy concluded. "I only hope it gets you." Hoover had once quietly dreamed of becoming president himself. By 1955, that ambition had long since faded, but Kennedy's letter clearly mattered. He framed it. It remained hanging on the wall of his office until the day he died. The letter became one piece of an unusually warm correspondence between two men whose private histories were both far more complicated than their public reputations. The FBI's own files reveal that Hoover maintained a remarkably cordial relationship with Joseph Kennedy, despite persistent allegations surrounding the origins of the Kennedy fortune. Many historians have argued that a significant portion of Joseph Kennedy's wealth was accumulated during Prohibition through liquor operations that intersected with organized crime. Frank Costello himself often claimed he had helped Joe Kennedy get rich, and even described the two men as former partners. Former President Harry Truman was even blunter. He reportedly described Joseph Kennedy as big a crook as we've got anywhere in this country. Whether those assessments were entirely fair remains debated. What is not debated is Hoover's willingness to cultivate Kennedy rather than investigate him. The relationship reportedly stretched back to the 1920s when Kennedy financed films in Hollywood. According to several accounts, Kennedy introduced Hoover to leading actresses whose public company helped counter the persistent rumors surrounding Hoover's private life. Years later, Hoover and Clyde Tolson became occasional guests at the Kennedy family's winter retreat in Florida. When plans emerged to establish the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation, Joseph Kennedy promised generous financial support. At one point, he even offered Hoover a highly paid position as chief of security within the Kennedy organization. The mutual admiration appeared genuine. Privately, however, Hoover possessed something every politician feared: information. Former FBI Assistant Director Carther DeLoach later recalled Hoover discussing John Kennedy's sexual behavior well before the presidency. According to DeLoach, Hoover remarked that Joseph Kennedy himself had once joked, "I should have gelded Jack when he was a small boy." The younger Kennedy's FBI file had existed for years. It was first opened during the Second World War, after British MI5 supplied reports concerning his social life while visiting his father, then the American ambassador to Britain. Those files expanded dramatically in 1941. While serving as a young naval intelligence officer, John Kennedy began a relationship with Inga Arvad, a Danish journalist living in Washington who had attracted FBI attention because of suspected Nazi sympathies. From the Bureau's perspective, Arvad represented a legitimate counterintelligence concern. The surveillance that followed was legally authorized. Hidden microphones monitored their conversations. Agents listened while the couple conducted their affair. When naval authorities transferred Kennedy out of Washington in an effort to separate them, the relationship briefly intensified rather than ended. Although the romance lasted only a matter of months, Hoover now possessed intimate knowledge of Kennedy's private life. The episode poisoned relations between the two men for years. Kennedy never forgot the surveillance. His friend Langdon Marvin later recalled that after Kennedy entered Congress, he became increasingly concerned about the recordings sitting inside FBI files. Kennedy wanted them returned. Marvin urged him to abandon the idea. Even if Hoover surrendered the originals, Marvin warned, copies would almost certainly remain. Worse still, Hoover would realize exactly how vulnerable Kennedy felt. The tapes would become leverage. According to Marvin, Kennedy reluctantly accepted that advice. If Hoover recognized Kennedy's anxiety, the balance of power had already shifted. Shortly after his election to the United States Senate, Kennedy requested the opportunity simply to shake Hoover's hand. From that point forward, he treated the FBI director with careful public respect, while privately referring to him in far less flattering terms. Hoover responded in predictable fashion. He continued collecting information. In 1959, another opportunity presented itself. Leonard and Florence Cater, a deeply religious Catholic couple, rented a room in their home to Pamela Turner, a young secretary employed in Senator Kennedy's office. They soon realized Turner received regular late-night visits from her employer. Appalled by what they believed to be adultery, the Caters secretly installed recording equipment and even photographed a man they identified as Kennedy leaving the property during the night. For months they documented the affair before attempting to interest newspapers in the story. No major publication touched it. Eventually, the material found its way to Hoover. According to later accounts, Hoover quietly secured copies of the recordings and allegedly offered them to Lyndon B. Johnson as potential political ammunition. Robert Baker, Johnson's longtime associate, later claimed Hoover regularly briefed Johnson about Kennedy's sexual behavior. According to Baker, the arrangement benefited both men. Johnson wanted reassurance that Hoover was not investigating him. Hoover preferred Johnson in the White House rather than John Kennedy. Whether every detail unfolded precisely that way remains disputed, but the political significance is unmistakable. Long before Kennedy entered the Oval Office, Hoover possessed a growing archive of deeply compromising material concerning the future president's private life. Those vulnerabilities extended beyond women. According to Anthony Summers and other researchers, John Kennedy's relationship with organized crime increasingly echoed the path taken years earlier by his father. The connection between the Kennedy family and the Mafia had not ended with Prohibition. If anything, it had evolved. Meyer Lansky's widow later claimed Kennedy met Lansky during a visit to Cuba in 1957 and even sought his advice about where to meet women. Around the same period, Kennedy attended Mass in Arizona alongside Augustus Smiling Gus Battaglia, a close associate of Joe Bonanno, before later meeting Bonanno himself. Whether individually significant or not, such encounters reflected how easily powerful political figures and organized crime leaders occasionally crossed paths during that era. The relationship became more consequential during the 1960 presidential campaign. According to numerous later accounts, Joseph Kennedy met with several underworld figures in California as his son pursued the Democratic nomination. He even repaired relations with Teamsters President Jimmy Hoffa, despite the relentless campaign Robert Kennedy had already begun against him. The family's political strategy often appeared remarkably different from Robert Kennedy's uncompromising approach to organized crime. Several sources, including FBI surveillance, organized crime informants, and later witness testimony, suggest the campaign actively sought Mafia assistance. Carlos Marcello was reportedly approached in the hope that he would use his influence to help John Kennedy secure Louisiana delegates at the Democratic National Convention. Marcello declined, having already committed himself to Lyndon Johnson. Others proved more receptive. Chicago boss Sam Giancana allegedly provided assistance. Years later, FBI wiretaps captured Giancana and Johnny Roselli discussing financial contributions made during Kennedy's critical West Virginia primary campaign. Judith Campbell Exner later claimed John Kennedy personally met Giancana on at least 2 occasions, and even used her as an intermediary to deliver large amounts of cash. Historians continue to debate aspects of Exner's testimony, but Hoover learned about elements of these relationships almost immediately. In March 1960, the very month Kennedy allegedly began discussing Giancana with Exner, the FBI received information from confidential Underworld sources claiming Joe Fischetti, one of Giancana's closest associates, together with other organized crime figures, was actively supporting Senator Kennedy's presidential campaign in the expectation that successful political influence would later provide them privileged access to a Kennedy administration. By July, as delegates gathered in Los Angeles for the Democratic National Convention, Robert Kennedy received reports that Hoover's agents were aggressively investigating alleged irregularities surrounding the West Virginia primary. According to those warnings, an extensive FBI report containing damaging information about John Kennedy was already moving toward the Justice Department. Kennedy appeared outwardly unconcerned. Privately, there was every reason to worry. During the convention, he continued juggling multiple relationships, including Judith Exner, Marilyn Monroe, and numerous other women. Los Angeles law enforcement also documented his contacts with prostitutes connected to organized crime-controlled vice operations. Those reports, too, eventually found their way into Hoover's expanding files. Friends warned Kennedy repeatedly that his behavior could one day destroy everything he hoped to achieve. He dismissed the danger. "They can't touch me while I'm alive," he reportedly told one confidant, "and after I'm dead, who cares?" It was a dangerous calculation. Hoover understood the implications better than anyone. He soon decided to test how much influence those files actually gave him. The morning after Kennedy secured the Democratic nomination, newspapers speculated that a President Kennedy might finally retire the aging FBI director. Hoover reacted immediately. According to Cartha DeLoach, Clyde Tolson instructed him to persuade a trusted journalist to raise the question publicly at Kennedy's next press conference. The question came exactly as planned. Would Hoover remain FBI director? Kennedy answered without hesitation. "That will be one of the first appointments I make." Less than 3 weeks after becoming the Democratic nominee, Kennedy had publicly committed himself to keeping Hoover in office. Whether motivated by political calculation, genuine respect, or fear of what Hoover possessed, the result was identical. Hoover had secured his future. Privately, Kennedy never concealed his contempt. He mocked Hoover as a master of public relations, and often joked that the 3 most overrated things in the world were Texas, the FBI, and whatever happened to be irritating him that particular day. Friends such as Gore Vidal later recalled Kennedy openly acknowledging rumors surrounding Hoover's sexuality. Others believed Kennedy understood something even more dangerous. Hoover possessed enough information to destroy him politically. Ben Bradley later said the entire Kennedy family feared Hoover. Columnist Jack Anderson reached the same conclusion. Kennedy himself admitted, Anderson recalled, that refusing to reappoint Hoover would have been politically catastrophic. On Election Day, Hoover wrote the president-elect a warm and carefully worded letter congratulating him on his victory, and assuring him that the FBI stood ready to provide every possible assistance. The tone was gracious. The balance of power remained anything but equal. If John Kennedy tolerated Hoover, his younger brother did not. Robert Kennedy arrived at the Department of Justice determined to dismantle the informal independence Hoover had built over nearly 4 decades. Everything about the new Attorney General irritated the FBI director. Robert Kennedy's casual manner offended Hoover's rigid sense of decorum. His tie often hung loosely around his neck. He worked in shirt sleeves. He propped his feet on his desk. Hoover privately complained that an Attorney General dressed so informally looked ridiculous. The cultural divide widened almost immediately. During one visit, Hoover found Robert Kennedy casually throwing darts across his office while discussing government business. More importantly, Kennedy dismantled Hoover's carefully protected chain of command. For years, Hoover had enjoyed direct access to presidents with minimal interference. Robert Kennedy insisted communication flow through the Attorney General's office. He initially ordered a buzzer installed, so Hoover could be summoned directly whenever required. Hoover quietly removed it. Telephone engineers soon arrived to install a dedicated hotline instead. The first time Robert Kennedy used it, Hoover's secretary answered. Kennedy's response was immediate. "When I pick up this phone," he reportedly snapped, "there's only one man I want to talk to. Get this phone on the director's desk immediately." In a matter of weeks, Robert Kennedy had done something few officials had ever attempted. He reminded J. Edgar Hoover that the director of the FBI answered to the Attorney General, not the other way around. John Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, later recalled virtually no direct telephone contact between the president and Hoover throughout the administration. The old relationship had been severed. Inside the White House, Hoover increasingly appeared detached from reality. He lectured young Justice Department lawyers about their weight. He warned officials that newspapers had been infiltrated by communists. He devoted lengthy conversations to rumors about the private lives of journalists, politicians, and public figures. After one particularly strange meeting, Robert Kennedy quietly asked aide John Seigenthaler, "He was out of it today, wasn't he?" Within the administration, staff began referring privately to Hoover's good days and his bad days. Years later, speaking on an embargoed basis for future historians, Robert Kennedy offered an extraordinarily blunt assessment. "I think he's rather a psycho." He described the FBI as a dangerous organization and suggested Hoover had become senile and increasingly frightening. Those opinions only hardened the conflict. Barely 2 weeks after John Kennedy entered the White House, columnist Drew Pearson revealed the first major confrontation. Robert Kennedy intended to create a dedicated strike force against organized crime. Hoover objected immediately. A specialized anti-racketeering unit, he argued, reflected badly upon the FBI. Joseph Kennedy privately opposed Robert's campaign for entirely different reasons. Having spent much of his own life navigating relationships with organized crime, he saw little benefit in provoking America's most powerful underworld figures. Robert Kennedy ignored them both. Unlike his father, unlike his brother, unlike J. Edgar Hoover, he intended to wage a genuine war against the Mafia. For the first time in decades, the criminal organizations Hoover had spent years treating as a secondary concern faced an Attorney General determined to make them the Justice Department's highest priority. Robert Kennedy entered the Justice Department, determined to wage war against organized crime. Hoover wanted no part of it. His first major memorandum to the new Attorney General did not focus on the Mafia, organized corruption, or racketeering. It focused instead on communism. "The Communist Party USA," Hoover wrote, "presents a greater menace to the internal security of our nation today than it ever has." Robert Kennedy thought the assessment bordered on fantasy. "It is such nonsense," he remarked during 1961, "to have to waste time prosecuting the Communist Party. It couldn't be more feeble and less of a threat, and besides, its membership consists largely of FBI agents." The clash was immediate. It was also unavoidable. Luther Houston, who had served the outgoing Attorney General, visited Hoover only days after Kennedy took office. When he arrived, he found Hoover already entertaining his new superior, or rather, enduring him. Kennedy had simply walked into Hoover's office without requesting an appointment. To Hoover, who expected rigid protocol from everyone around him, the gesture bordered on insult. After Kennedy departed, Houston entered the office. "I'll tell you," he later recalled, "the maddest man I ever talked to was J. Edgar Hoover." Hoover was furious. Kennedy had discussed establishing a new investigative body to supplement, or, from Hoover's perspective, duplicate, the work of the FBI. Hoover reportedly warned that if such an organization were created, he might as well retire immediately. His pension was waiting. The disagreement leaked almost at once. Newspapers began reporting an open feud between the FBI director and the Attorney General. Watching events unfold from Florida, Joseph Kennedy hurriedly denied there was any conflict. After a round of golf with actor Tony Curtis, he assured reporters the rumors were absurd. "Both Jack and Bob admire Hoover," he insisted. "They feel they're lucky to have him as head of the FBI." Privately, however, Joseph Kennedy pleaded with his sons to humor Hoover. He understood something they increasingly ignored. Hoover was dangerous. A carefully staged meeting at the White House in February 1961, one of only 6 occasions on which President Kennedy agreed to see Hoover during his entire presidency, appears to have been an attempt to restore some measure of peace. If that was its purpose, it failed. Robert Kennedy simply worked around Hoover. Denied his requested National Crime Commission, the Attorney General dramatically expanded the Justice Department's own organized crime section instead. Staff numbers increased. Funding multiplied. Prosecutors were recruited in unprecedented numbers. Whether Hoover approved became irrelevant. The campaign moved ahead without him. For the first time in decades, organized crime found itself under sustained federal pressure. Carlos Marcello became a principal target. Sam Giancana became another. The same FBI that had spent years leaving many Mafia bosses largely undisturbed suddenly subjected them to relentless surveillance and investigation. No one felt the betrayal more personal than Sam Giancana. According to numerous accounts, Giancana believed he had helped John Kennedy reach the White House through political influence and vote-buying operations in Illinois and elsewhere. Whether those claims were entirely accurate remains debated, but Giancana clearly believed he had earned political protection. Instead, Robert Kennedy declared war. To Giancana, it was a double cross. His anger exploded publicly on July 12, 1961. While traveling through Chicago's O'Hare Airport with his companion, singer Phyllis McGuire, Giancana found himself confronted by a group of FBI agents led by veteran investigator William Romer. Giancana immediately understood that every word he spoke would eventually reach Hoover. He exploded. "Fuck J. Edgar Hoover." Then he went further. "Fuck your super boss, and your super boss. You know who I mean. I mean the Kennedys." He cursed both brothers repeatedly before turning directly to Romer. "Listen, Romer. I know all about the Kennedys, and Phyllis knows more about the Kennedys. One of these days we're going to tell each other." For investigators listening, it was an extraordinary outburst. Giancana was not merely venting his frustration. He was suggesting he possessed information capable of seriously embarrassing the President of the United States. 6 months later, columnist Drew Pearson publicly predicted what many inside Washington already suspected. Hoover's relationship with Robert Kennedy had become unsustainable. The FBI director, Pearson said, resented taking orders from a young kid like Bobby. And unless circumstances changed, Hoover himself would soon be eased out. The prediction caused immediate concern inside the White House. Only days later, Robert Kennedy sent a handwritten note to his brother regarding the forthcoming State of the Union address. He urged the president to retain a favorable reference to the FBI. "It is only one sentence," he wrote, "and it would make a big difference for us." The request suggests how delicate the relationship had become. At almost the same time, Hoover received intelligence from his own informants, claiming the Kennedy administration intended to remove him. According to the reports, State Department Security Director William Boswell had already been identified as Hoover's likely replacement. Shortly afterwards, the White House requested Hoover's presence. On March 22, 1962, Hoover arrived at the White House. He entered shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The meeting that followed remains one of the most mysterious encounters of the Kennedy presidency. Only 3 men participated: President Kennedy, J. Edgar Hoover, senior White House aide Kenneth O'Donnell. For 4 hours they talked behind closed doors. No official transcript exists. The Kennedy Library possesses no detailed record. The FBI's own files contain no memorandum summarizing the discussion, despite Hoover's long-standing habit of documenting virtually every important White House meeting. The silence itself has fueled decades of speculation. Whatever occurred inside that room, it ended badly. Years later, Kenneth O'Donnell would reveal only one detail. After Hoover finally departed, President Kennedy turned in frustration and muttered, "Get rid of that bastard. He's the biggest bore." By then, Hoover possessed information that reached far beyond ordinary political gossip. Ironically, much of it had emerged because Robert Kennedy had intensified pressure on Sam Giancana. Even before Dwight Eisenhower left office, Hoover learned fragments of a covert plot to assassinate Fidel Castro. He knew organized crime figures were somehow involved. During the first months of the Kennedy administration, he discovered something even more sensitive. The CIA itself was working with Sam Giancana. By March 1962, Hoover also knew that Judith Campbell Exner, one of President Kennedy's lovers, maintained close contact with Giancana. He knew Giancana had threatened to expose the Kennedy family. Recent FBI wiretaps had also intercepted conversations between Giancana and Johnny Roselli, discussing miniature listening devices capable of secretly recording conversations. During the same discussions, they referred to Bobby and discussed his movements to Washington. Hoover now held pieces of several dangerous puzzles. Judith Exner later recalled receiving a telephone call from President Kennedy shortly after Hoover left the White House. Kennedy instructed her not to telephone from her own apartment. Instead, she was told to go to her mother's house before calling him back. When she did, Kennedy sounded furious. According to Exner, he warned her that Hoover knew she associated with 2 organized crime figures and that he knew she had visited the White House. Exner believed Hoover had raised her name directly during the meeting. According to her later account, there was an even deeper reason for Kennedy's concern. She claimed the president admitted he had resumed contact with Sam Giancana after entering the White House. This time, she said, the meetings related to plans for the removal of Fidel Castro. Most historians now accept that the Kennedy administration authorized covert efforts to remove Castro, including assassination plots involving organized crime figures. The precise extent of John Kennedy's personal involvement remains debated, but substantial evidence confirms that both the CIA and the Justice Department became entangled in operations targeting the Cuban leader following the Bay of Pigs disaster. Exner claimed Kennedy used her as a courier roughly 20 times, carrying sealed envelopes between the president and Giancana. She insisted she never opened them. Kennedy allegedly told her they contained intelligence relating to the Castro operation. If true, it was an extraordinarily reckless arrangement. Giancana now believed he had assisted Kennedy twice, first during the election, then during covert operations against Castro. Yet Robert Kennedy continued treating him as one of organized crime's highest priorities. Whether Hoover fully understood every aspect of that relationship in March 1962 remains uncertain. He understood enough. Exner later concluded that Hoover effectively warned the president he knew she had been passing material between Kennedy and Giancana. Former FBI Assistant Director Cartha DeLoach offered a similar recollection. After returning from the White House, Hoover remarked that he had made it clear to the president he knew a great deal about what was happening. Removing Hoover was no longer a realistic option. Even without the Giancana affair, Hoover possessed an expanding catalogue of compromising information. He already knew about Kennedy's use of prostitutes during the 1960 Democratic Convention. He monitored reports concerning the president's relationships with actresses and socialites. Among those repeatedly mentioned was Angie Dickinson. According to several later accounts, Dickinson and Kennedy began an affair shortly before the inauguration. Photographer Slim Aarons, a friend of the Kennedy family, later claimed the two disappeared together for several days in Palm Springs before Kennedy entered the White House. How Hoover allegedly learned of the relationship became another extraordinary story. A former FBI agent who worked alongside the Secret Service later described an incident involving a charter flight from Burbank to Palm Springs. Kennedy and Dickinson traveled together aboard an executive aircraft equipped with a private cabin. Unknown to them, according to the former agent, a crew member secretly recorded conversations inside the cabin. Later, the employee allegedly attempted to extort the president using the recording. The Secret Service intercepted the demand before it reached Kennedy. The FBI quietly traced the source. Rather than prosecute, agents reportedly entered the man's apartment while he was overseas, recovered the tape from a hiding place inside a wall near an electrical socket, replaced the wall exactly as they found it, and dismissed the employee through discussions with his employer. The recording itself, according to the former agent, was delivered personally to Hoover. No publicity, no criminal charges. Just another sensitive file added to the director's collection. Meanwhile, Hoover's attention shifted to the woman whose name would become forever intertwined with the Kennedy presidency: Marilyn Monroe. There is now broad historical agreement that Monroe and President Kennedy conducted an intermittent affair during the early years of his administration. Accounts describe Monroe being quietly brought into Kennedy's suite at New York's Carlisle Hotel and, on at least one occasion, allegedly traveling aboard Air Force One disguised beneath a black wig and dark sunglasses to avoid attracting attention. Each new relationship, each new report, each new indiscretion strengthened Hoover's position. By 1962, the director of the FBI possessed not merely political intelligence on the president, he possessed leverage. And in Washington, leverage often proved far more valuable than power itself. John Kennedy's private life became increasingly reckless. At any other moment in history, his secret meetings and affairs would have carried enormous political risk. By 1962, however, those risks had multiplied. Marilyn Monroe's emotional health was deteriorating. Organized crime believed it had been betrayed by the Kennedy administration, and J. Edgar Hoover was quietly collecting intelligence on almost everyone involved. The result was a web of surveillance unlike anything Washington had seen before. According to Chuck Giancana, half-brother of Chicago Mafia boss Sam Giancana, the relentless campaign being waged by Robert Kennedy convinced Giancana that cooperation with the Kennedys had achieved nothing. If political favors would not protect him, another weapon might: blackmail. Chuck Giancana later claimed that Sam hired surveillance specialists to gather compromising material on both President Kennedy and the Attorney General. At almost the same time, someone else was already watching. Peter Lawford's beach house had become one of the Kennedy family's favorite private meeting places. It was also where Marilyn Monroe, entertainers, politicians, and, according to numerous accounts, organized crime figures occasionally crossed paths. The property was quietly placed under electronic surveillance. The man who installed the listening devices remained anonymous for decades, speaking only on condition that his identity never be revealed. According to his account, the operation was carried out for the FBI through an intermediary. He claimed he personally installed microphones throughout Lawford's home during the late summer of 1961. Listening devices were allegedly hidden in the living room, bedrooms, and even one of the bathrooms. Officially, he was told the purpose was to monitor organized crime figures, particularly Sam Giancana, who was known to visit the property. Unofficially, the operation captured far more than Mafia conversations. Both President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy regularly visited the house. According to the installer, Robert Kennedy had specifically ordered that Lawford's residence should never be subjected to electronic surveillance. Hoover ignored the instruction. The house was bugged anyway. The anonymous technician later claimed that one set of recordings eventually reached Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa after being leaked by one of the operatives involved. Hoffa, he alleged, paid a substantial sum to acquire the material. The overwhelming majority of the recordings, however, went directly to the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover, he later recalled, had access to every goddamned thing that happened at the beach house. If true, Hoover possessed an extraordinary intelligence source. Private investigator John Danoff later claimed he was among those who monitored the recordings. According to Danoff, during President Kennedy's November 1961 visit, he listened as Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe conducted an intimate encounter inside the house. Whether every aspect of those recollections can be independently verified remains disputed. What is certain is that Hoover's appetite for surveillance extended well beyond organized crime. The recordings became another source of political leverage. On February 8, 1962, Marilyn Monroe attended a dinner party at Peter Lawford's home, where she met Robert Kennedy for the first time. Later that evening, Monroe reportedly told friends she and the Attorney General spent time speaking privately in the den. Among the questions she raised was one circulating widely throughout Washington. Was J. Edgar Hoover about to be dismissed? According to Monroe's recollection, Robert Kennedy replied that he and the president wanted to remove Hoover, but did not yet believe they possessed the political strength to do so. If the house was indeed under FBI surveillance, Hoover would have read those remarks in transcript form. The message could not have been more reassuring. The Kennedy brothers wanted him gone. They simply lacked the confidence to try. Hoover therefore had every incentive to continue gathering information. Every intercepted conversation, every affair, every indiscretion strengthened his position. By the time Hoover met President Kennedy for their 4-hour White House lunch in March 1962, he reportedly knew not only about Judith Exner and Sam Giancana, but also about Monroe's relationship with the president and Robert Kennedy's private comments regarding Hoover himself. If Kennedy believed he could quietly continue the affair, he was mistaken. Within 48 hours of that White House meeting, he saw Monroe again during a visit to California. Meanwhile, relations between Hoover and the Kennedy administration continued to deteriorate. Robert Kennedy and Hoover increasingly found themselves on opposite sides of almost every major issue. Marilyn Monroe's story, however, was becoming even more complicated. According to numerous later accounts, President Kennedy's relationship with Monroe gradually faded after their final meeting on May 19, 1962. Robert Kennedy, however, allegedly became closer to her during the weeks that followed. Whatever the precise nature of that relationship, Monroe was descending into a profound emotional crisis. In attempting to distance himself, Robert Kennedy instead became entangled in a situation growing more dangerous by the day. He now faced 2 separate surveillance operations, one allegedly orchestrated by Giancana and Hoffa, the other overseen by J. Edgar Hoover. On June 27, 1962, Monroe's housekeeper later recalled seeing Robert Kennedy arrive alone at Monroe's Los Angeles home, driving a Cadillac convertible. Within days, according to former FBI Assistant Director Carther DeLoach, a memorandum from Los Angeles Special Agent in charge, William Simon reached Hoover's desk documenting the visit. "I remember it coming in," DeLoach later recalled. "I was shocked." According to DeLoach, the report identified the vehicle Kennedy was using and linked it directly to Monroe's residence. From that point onward, former Bureau officials claimed Robert Kennedy's movements in California received particularly close FBI attention. Heavily censored bureau files indicate that during the June visit, Robert Kennedy and Monroe also met for lunch at Peter Lawford's home. One surviving reference records them discussing the morality of nuclear weapons testing. At the height of the Cold War, Hoover regarded conversations touching upon nuclear policy as matters of potential national security. Monroe maintained friendships with numerous people on the political left. That fact, from Hoover's perspective, provided justification for continuing surveillance that had originally begun for very different reasons. Then came August 4th, 1962. Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home. The official autopsy concluded she died from acute barbiturate poisoning caused by an overdose. The coroner classified the death as a probable suicide. The circumstances have remained the subject of debate ever since. Alternative theories have suggested the drugs may have been administered by someone else, although no conclusive evidence has established that claim. Chuck Giancana later asserted that his half-brother believed Monroe had been murdered because exposing Robert Kennedy's relationship with the actress had become politically useful. Other researchers reached different conclusions. Numerous witnesses, including years later Peter Lawford himself, described Robert Kennedy traveling to Los Angeles on the day Monroe died and engaging in a heated confrontation with her. According to those accounts, the argument left Monroe deeply distressed, prompting psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson to attend the house. Years later, Greenson privately acknowledged that Robert Kennedy had been present at Monroe's home on the evening of her death. Another detail immediately complicated the investigation. Investigators reportedly found a crumpled piece of paper among Monroe's belongings containing a White House telephone number. Almost as quickly as it appeared, the evidence vanished. Monroe's telephone records disappeared. Captain James Hamilton of the Los Angeles Police Intelligence Division, a longtime acquaintance of Robert Kennedy, later became associated with aspects of the subsequent handling of the case. Yet according to one reporter investigating Monroe's death at the time, the crucial telephone records had already been removed from the general telephone offices by the morning after her death. Company Division Manager Robert Tiarks reportedly stated they had been taken by the FBI. A former senior bureau official later confirmed that FBI personnel from outside Los Angeles arrived almost immediately after Monroe died. They were on the scene before anyone realized what had happened, he later recalled. According to his understanding, agents removed the telephone records under orders from someone higher than Hoover himself. Whether those instructions originated with the Attorney General or the President, he could not say. Carther DeLoach remembered another detail. Communications arriving from Los Angeles reported that a White House telephone number had been discovered beside Monroe's bed. For President Kennedy, Monroe's death appears to have brought home the scale of the danger. White House logs show Peter Lawford telephoned the president shortly after Monroe's body was discovered. Earlier that morning, Lawford had reportedly instructed private security consultants to remove evidence linking Monroe to either Kennedy brother. The following day, Judith Exner twice attempted to telephone the White House. On both occasions, President Kennedy declined to speak. The affair that had connected organized crime, covert operations, and the White House appeared finally to be ending. If organized crime hoped Monroe's death would destroy Robert Kennedy, those efforts largely failed. The damage was contained. Yet the successful containment carried its own price. By quietly obtaining Monroe's telephone records and controlling sensitive information, Hoover increased the Kennedy administration's dependence upon him. Only 48 hours later, on August 7, 1962, Robert Kennedy did something that surprised many observers. Earlier that day, W. H. Ferry of the Ford Foundation's Fund for the Republic publicly dismissed Hoover's warnings about communism as sententious poppycock. Privately, Robert Kennedy had often expressed similar opinions. This time, however, he rushed to Hoover's defense. Publicly, he praised the FBI director's anti-communist work and declared he hoped Hoover would continue serving the country for many years. The sudden change in tone has long invited speculation. Whether it reflected political necessity, gratitude, or simple pragmatism remains uncertain. Hoover would, in fact, remain director for another decade. He survived both John and Robert Kennedy. On May 2, 1972, after nearly half a century leading the FBI, Hoover arrived at headquarters without Clyde Tolson, whose own health had deteriorated significantly. It proved to be Hoover's final day. That morning, columnist Jack Anderson intensified his campaign against the FBI, revealing the existence of bureau dossiers containing intensely private information on politicians, journalists, civil rights leaders, and public figures. Appearing before Congress, Anderson declared he had personally examined FBI sex files and offered to provide documentation to investigators. For Hoover, the timing could not have been worse. Advance copies of 2 highly critical books also reached his desk. J. Robert Nash's Citizen Hoover challenged the mythology surrounding the FBI director and portrayed him as both protector and oppressor, truth-teller and deceiver. Reporter Hank Messick's John Edgar Hoover went further still, exploring Hoover's relationships with Louis Rosenstiel and raising uncomfortable questions about organized crime's extraordinary influence over the Bureau. Unlike earlier decades, Hoover could no longer suppress publication through quiet pressure behind the scenes. The books would appear regardless. Hoover remained at work until early evening before dining with Clyde Tolson. Returning home later that night, he reportedly poured himself his customary glass of Jack Daniels from the musical decanter that played "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" whenever it was lifted. According to longtime Secretary Helen Gandy, President Richard Nixon telephoned Hoover sometime between 10 o'clock and midnight. Gandy later claimed Nixon again urged Hoover to retire. Disturbed by the conversation, Hoover reportedly telephoned Tolson afterwards to discuss it. If Gandy's account is correct, Hoover retired to bed deeply shaken. The next morning he was found dead on the floor of his bedroom, half-dressed, alone. President Nixon's reported first reaction was blunt. "Jesus Christ, that old cocksucker." Almost immediately, aides were instructed to secure Hoover's papers and determine what sensitive material remained. Many of Hoover's most loyal associates acted first. Large numbers of confidential files disappeared. Others were quietly destroyed. Hoover received a state funeral. Politicians across America hailed him as a national hero. Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, declared that no 20th century American had contributed more to the nation. History has delivered a more complicated verdict. Subsequent investigations revealed extensive abuses of power, illegal surveillance, political manipulation, and covert files assembled on thousands of American citizens whose only offense had often been disagreement with Hoover's worldview. Yet even after those revelations, Hoover's name continued to dominate FBI headquarters in Washington, cast in gold letters above the institution he had shaped for nearly half a century. His influence endured long after his death. So did the unanswered questions surrounding the hidden relationships, secret files, and compromises that had defined one of the most powerful and controversial careers in American history. Hale Boggs came from Louisiana, a state where Carlos Marcello's influence was impossible for a serious politician to ignore. Marcello's organization touched gambling, labor, local government, immigration matters, and political patronage. It operated around New Orleans and Jefferson Parish with a reach that extended far beyond street crime. Boggs understood Louisiana. He understood the ports, the ward organizations, the sheriffs, the businessmen, and the unofficial power structures that operated alongside elected government. A Louisiana congressman of his seniority could not have remained completely unaware of Marcello's significance. Boggs also knew the culture of New Orleans. He knew that the city had long served as a bridge between the United States, Cuba, Central America, and the Caribbean. He understood that shipping companies, fruit firms, dock labor, political machines and underworld organizations had occupied the same physical and economic terrain for decades. That background makes his later doubts about the Warren Commission especially important. Boggs signed the report in 1964. Publicly, he supported its central conclusions, but over the following years, his confidence appears to have weakened. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 deepened the national crisis. Political murder no longer appeared to be a single, isolated event. It looked like part of a wider collapse in which major public figures could be removed and the country provided with a simple explanation before every serious question had been answered. Boggs became increasingly critical of J. Edgar Hoover and the power of the FBI. In April 1971, he delivered a dramatic speech on the floor of the House, accusing federal agencies of engaging in surveillance and intimidation. He warned that the FBI and other agencies were creating what he regarded as a system approaching secret police power. He claimed that members of Congress were being monitored and that government intelligence services had escaped meaningful oversight. His language was extraordinary for a man who had served on the Warren Commission. Boggs was no longer speaking like someone who believed federal investigative agencies could be trusted automatically. He was speaking like a man who had seen how information could be controlled. Accounts of his private views suggest that he also developed doubts about important parts of the Commission's case, including the single bullet theory. Some later writers have claimed that he wanted the investigation reopened or believed the Commission had been misled. The full extent of Hale Boggs's skepticism would never be known. By 1971, however, he had stopped speaking quietly. He stood on the floor of the House and accused the federal intelligence apparatus of operating beyond democratic control. He spoke about surveillance, intimidation, and agencies that had grown powerful enough to watch elected officials without consequence. His trust in the Warren Report also dropped when he learned more about Ruby, Ferry, Bannister, Cuban exiles, CIA, and the training camps in Louisiana. The report treated Jack Ruby largely as an emotionally unstable nightclub owner and Lee Harvey Oswald as an isolated Marxist. It did not seriously examine the broader Gulf Coast environment in which Ferry, Ruby, Marcello, Trafficante, anti-Castro militants, gun runners and intelligence-linked operators moved through overlapping circles. Boggs would have known that Louisiana politics did not work in isolation. He would have known that men such as Marcello did not need to appear personally in every transaction. Their power traveled through lawyers, fixers, police officers, union officials, businessmen, and political intermediaries. Perhaps that was what eventually troubled him. Not that the Commission had necessarily invented its evidence, but that it had accepted a narrow framework before investigating the wider system. This was not an outsider speaking. This was the House Majority Leader, a former member of the Warren Commission, a man who had sat inside the room and watched the evidence arrive through the FBI and the CIA. In Louisiana, words like that did not disappear into the congressional record. They traveled. A congressman could make a speech in Washington in the afternoon, and by evening the essential details would be moving through New Orleans. A lawyer would hear it. A lobbyist would repeat it. A sheriff's man would mention it over dinner. A union official would make a telephone call. Someone connected to the ports would pass it to someone connected to the clubs. By the time the newspapers appeared the following morning, Carlos Marcello's people would already know what Boggs had said and how loudly he had said it. Marcello did not need to listen to the speech himself. That was what networks were for. Boggs had represented Louisiana for decades. He understood how power operated there, and the men around Marcello understood Boggs. They knew which committees he sat on, which officials he trusted, and which subjects made him uncomfortable. More importantly, they would have recognized the danger in a former Warren commissioner publicly declaring that the agencies behind the investigation could not be trusted. Boggs was not merely attacking Hoover. He was undermining the machinery that had protected the official account. The report would have reached Marcello without drama. There would have been no grand conference and no theatrical order. Marcello rarely needed to explain himself at length. A name would be mentioned. A concern would be expressed. A trusted man would be told to find out where Boggs was going, who was traveling with him, and what arrangements had been made. Then the work would move away from Marcello. That was the point. Private aviation in the post-war decades operated through a loose and often intimate world of charter companies, mechanics, hangar owners, fuel suppliers, freight operators, and local airport employees. Organized crime figures, and especially the CIA, had long understood its usefulness. Aircraft could move cash, couriers, narcotics, weapons, and passengers without the scrutiny attached to commercial travel. The men who controlled the hangars did not need to own the aircraft. They only needed access. They knew which planes were serviced. They knew who performed the maintenance. They knew when a pilot filed a route, when a passenger changed his plans, and when an aircraft would sit unattended overnight. They knew which mechanic owed money, which operator gambled, and which employee could be persuaded to leave a door unlocked. In that world, touching an aircraft did not require a team of assassins. It required one man with access and another man prepared not to ask questions. Nothing had to look broken. A connection could be loosened. An instrument could be disturbed. A fuel line could be compromised. A radio could fail at the wrong altitude. A navigation system could begin lying when the aircraft entered bad weather. The damage did not have to bring the plane down immediately. It only had to place the pilot in a situation from which weather, terrain, and confusion would finish the job. The best sabotage never looked like sabotage. It looked like bad luck. On October 16, 1972, Boggs boarded a twin-engine Cessna 310 in Alaska with Congressman Nick Begich, Begich's aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns. They were flying from Anchorage to Juneau through a region of mountains, cold water, and rapidly changing weather. The aircraft vanished. No distress call was conclusively received. No wreckage was recovered. No bodies were found. The largest search in American history up to that time produced nothing that settled what had happened. The aircraft reportedly carried an emergency locator transmitter, but no signal led rescuers to the wreck. Questions were later raised about the equipment aboard the plane and whether the available emergency beacon was functioning or properly installed. The aircraft did not carry the kind of modern flight data recorder associated with commercial airliners, leaving investigators without a mechanical record of its final minutes. There was no black box waiting to explain the descent. There was only silence.